Hello again, everybody. This is Dr. Hathcock, and now we're going to look at the fifth topic that we have, which is the American Revolution. And as I was discussing previously with colonialism, the relationship, I guess go ahead and get into this. The colonial relationship in 1763 was very good. Sorry for my squeaky chair again. It was a very good relationship. People in the colonies were happy, people in the mother country were happy. So up to 1763, things were going quite well. But from 1763 going forward, things began to rapidly change. In explaining the revolution, I'm going to look at the causes, and there's quite a laundry list of causes. But once we get through all the reasons why the revolution happened, we'll look at what happened because of the revolution. Let's see, Declaration of Independence. Let's see, colonies becoming states, things like that. And then last but not least, we'll look at the conflict itself, the war. Talk about a couple of key things like Saratoga and Yorktown. All right, so this is the last topic before you take exam number one, and I'll do a review to get you ready for exam number one as well. Okay, in looking at the causes, the first thing we have to look at is something called the Treaty of Paris 1763. With this Treaty of Paris in 1763, you have the end of a war between England and France, and it is the end of the French and Indian War. Now, this war was fought for 9 long years in North America, and when it's over with, it's a complete loss for the French and a total victory for the British. What happens as a result of the Treaty of Paris 1763 is the French are forced to give up their North American colonies. If you look at the map in the middle down at the bottom, where you see a lot of red for Great Britain, green for Spain, the British basically take over Canada and all that land out to the Mississippi River with the Treaty of Paris 1763. So with the end of the French and Indian War, the British become the dominant nation on earth. It's an absolutely huge victory for them. And the land they acquire is larger than Europe itself. So it's a total win for the British. In the colonies, there's a feeling of euphoria, patriotism, the flag is flying. People are very happy with the British victory and driving the French out of North America. But with all this new land comes new responsibilities, and a whole host of new problems begin to pop up for the British after 1763. Looking here at point number 2, new problems of empire. The West itself is going to be a problem for the British in years to come. Let's see, if you look at the map on the bottom right-hand side where it says the Proclamation Line of 1763, I'll talk more in depth about that in a moment. But if you look on this map and you'll see there kind of in the middle, there's this big brown area called the Indian Reserve. Well, the West became a problem for the British because Native Americans did not care for the British taking over and taking their lands. The people who lived here had always been loyal to the French. They believed that the French were their fathers, as they called them, their French fathers, if you will. And yeah, they did not like being taken over by the enemy, being taken over by the British. So there's a lot of resentment coming from the West, coming from these Native Americans towards the British. Really, what happened here more than anything is the British never really got a chance to pacify the West. They never really got that chance to sit down and negotiate with the tribes, try to get them to understand, hey, look, we're not as bad as we were made out to be. But the West would constantly be a problem for the British going forward. And truth be told, even when the United States wins this revolution and takes over the West, that area is going to be a problem for the United States as well going forward. So they would have problems with the West. Under number 2, letter B, trade regulations. It was uncovered during the French and Indian War that people living up in the New England areas, your Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire types of places, But it was uncovered during the French and Indian War that people living in the New England area had been trading with and selling weapons to the French during the war. So basically, these British colonial people were selling and trading with the enemy in a time of war. This upset King George III very much, the gentleman on the bottom left of our slide. George III was irate with the people of New England. It's treason. It's disloyal. It's just bad all around. And he would never forgive these people in the New England area for what they did. I would never forgive them for trading with the enemy in a time of war. In fact, to get at these people, to sort of punish them for what they had done, His Majesty was looking to do something about trading to the enemy in a time of war. And some of his advisors went back and looked and tried to figure out what could be done. And they happened upon the old Navigation Acts. And they said, well, Your Majesty, you don't even have to pass these laws. They already exist. We could just start enforcing them again. So under George III's direction, the Navigation Acts will be brought back. They'll start to regulate trade the way they had done before. So, yes, selling weapons to the enemy in a time of war led King George III to reinstitute the Navigation Acts. One more time before we go forward. Yes, George III never forgave these people for what they did. He always would hold a special place of hatred in his heart for the New England area. And truth be told, they felt the same way about him. Okay, the next problem of empire is the national debt. And wars are expensive. I think we've talked previously about how much it costs to have a military. And yeah, this war was very expensive. As a result of this war, the national debt in England begins to skyrocket. It really does start to get out of control. When the French and Indian War is over with, the British have a massive amount of debt on their hands. And George III felt like the colonies should help pay their share of that national debt. Now, at that point in time, 1760s, the people living in England are the most heavily taxed people on earth. And now with this war over with, the king is going to have to go back to the people of England and say, you know, clapping hands, yay, we won the war, patriotism and all that. But now we have to pay for the war. So yes, you're already so heavily taxed, but I'm going to have to raise your taxes even higher to pay for this war. He wasn't looking forward to that, and he didn't think it would sit well with the people of England. So rather than just raise taxes on the people living in England proper, His Majesty felt like revenue should be generated off the colonies to help offset some of that debt. After all, the war was waged in North America for their benefit, he argued, for their security. So yes, King George III will believe that in an effort to pay off England's national debt, the colonies in North America should be taxed to help alleviate the debt. I don't know for a fact if he read a history book or not, but all he had to do was look back to James II, the Dominion of New England, to know that that probably wasn't going to work. But His Majesty was dead set on the colonies paying their fair share of the national debt. By the way, one more little item on that national debt. So France lost this war. They lost this French and Indian War, but their national debt skyrocketed as a result of it as well. And that's in part going to help fuel a lot of the problems going forward for the French. Eventually, there's going to be a French Revolution along the way. So the national debt problems coming out of this conflict not only triggered the American Revolution, but in part they also have a contributing hand in the French Revolution that's going to come later on down the line. Okay, so the Treaty of Paris 1763 is a huge blessing for the British. They win the French and Indian War, they take over all that land, but they have all these problems coming out of it with the problems out west with natives, trade regulations with the New England areas, and then the skyrocketing national debt as a result. Okay, well, points 3 and 4 here, Pontiac's Rebellion and the Proclamation of 1763, those go straight to the problems of the West. Let's deal with those for just a moment. But Pontiac was a Native American warrior. He lived in the Great Lakes region, and he was a chief of the Ottawa tribe. That's Ottawa, the Ottawa. And Pontiac just never stopped fighting. The French may have surrendered and signed a peace treaty. The French left all their Native American allies to fend for themselves, and Pontiac and the Ottawa just didn't stop fighting. They continued to carry on the cause. So Americans believed, well, I can't call them that yet. I don't know why I keep doing that. British colonials believed that with the French removed from the West, it was now time to move west and take the land and start farming and scratching out a living. So colonials really saw the West as theirs by right. Uh, this is very racist, but you know the colonials saw Native Americans as heathens, as lesser people who really didn't have a title to the land. People started heading out west. They would cross the Appalachian Mountains and head off into that Indian Reserve, looking to farm, looking to make a home, all that sort of stuff. And under Pontiac's rebellion, anytime colonial settlers went into the Great Lakes region, they were attacked by Native Americans. Like whole families were killed in these episodes. So that the fighting continued with natives like Pontiac. And that meant that the British had to send more soldiers out west. They had to spend more money putting down these rebellions that took place out west. And at some point, King George III just wanted a timeout on all this fighting in North America. He just wanted a chance for peace to come about. He really wanted a chance for the British Empire to be able to negotiate with these natives out west, try to end the fighting. But each time colonials crossed the Appalachians and went into that Indian Reserve and took land, get killed, then the fighting just continues. So, in an effort to try to call a timeout, if you will, His Majesty issues the Proclamation of 1763. A proclamation is when a king speaks. It's like an order, something to be carried out. And in the Proclamation of 1763, King George III basically told the colonials to not head west, stay back east, to stay in their colonies, and to not cross the Appalachian Mountains and head out into the Indian Reserve. Again, what George III wants is a chance for peace, for these colonials to just simply stay where they are. Then that could give the British Empire a chance to head out west and negotiate with the tribes. Here you can see on this bottom right-hand side, we have a proclamation line of 1763. And yeah, with that, basically the king is saying, do not cross this boundary, do not cross this line. Truth be told, a lot of that line is the Appalachian Mountains. Not all of it, but a lot of it is. So yeah, colonial people are being told to not head west. Well, it's very telling that colonials defied the proclamation line anyway. Colonials continued to head west. They continued to cross the mountains. In fact, George Washington, who was living in Virginia, he headed west. He crossed that proclamation line. He went off into something that Native Americans called Kentucky, and was, you know, trying to acquire some land in that part of the world. Washington referred to the proclamation line of 1763 as nothing more than a shield for heathen people, referring to the Native Americans. It's very telling in these moments that colonials don't fully respect this king. They're defying his law. They're defying the proclamation and the line that he established there in 1763. So I guess in this instant, you can say that the colonials are causing a problem. That by heading out west, they're causing more conflict, which continues this war. And yeah, the British have to send more soldiers and spend more money on dealing with these problems out here to the west. All right, so those problems to the west will just continue as things go on. All right, well, these next few points, starting with the Revenue Act, really deal with the debt problem coming out of the French and Indian War. And how's that saying go? The money is the root of all evil. Yeah, money is very much the root of the American Revolution as well. Okay, after the French and Indian War comes to an end, There's a gentleman by the name of George Grenville. He's at the bottom left-hand side of our slide. He comes to power. He becomes the guy who's in charge of the treasury for the British Empire. It's his job to pay the debts, bring money in, pay the debts that they have. So he's in charge of this national debt problem emerging from the French and Indian War. Grenville is backed by King George III, really handpicked for the role. And I've always tried to tell my students this: all that George Grenville did is exactly what the king told him to do. And with the Revenue Act and the Stamp Act of 1765, George Grenville is trying to generate revenue off the colonies to help pay for the national debt. All right, let's start with the Revenue Act of 1764. Grenville passed a series of tariffs, that is to say, those taxes on foreign products, under the Revenue Act. This was about generating revenue through tariffs, taxes on foreign products in the colonies. Now, there were a handful of people in the colonies who hemmed and hawed and argued that this wasn't right, but the vast majority of the colonial people said, hey, you know what? The British have the right to do this. They always have. Remember the Molasses Act that we talked about in the last topic? So, yeah, the feeling in the colonies really was one of the British have the right to do this. So there wasn't like huge scale protest against the Revenue Act of 1764. And I always bring it up because I kind of want to say, like, the colonies were not ready to rebel. This wasn't a powder keg ready to explode. And the Revenue Act shows you that. Look, it's understood. The British have the right to do this. They can do this. So the Revenue Act of 1764 didn't face a lot of opposition in the colonies. Again, there were some people who got upset. But the general attitude towards the Revenue Act was the British have the right to institute tariffs. So, yes, they can carry forward with that right. But then in 1765, Grenville and Parliament will pass the Stamp Act, and all hell will break loose with passage of the Stamp Act of 1765. Because the Stamp Act of 1765 was a direct tax against England's North American colonies. This tax was against all the colonies. You'll remember in the Dominion of New England, we talked about James II and Edmund Andros. Those direct taxes have been levied against those New England colonies. Well, this Stamp Act of 1765 is for all 13 of England's North American colonies. People in Virginia are going to have to pay it. People in New York are going to have to pay it. So yes, this was a direct tax levied against the colonies of North America. Now, the Stamp Act was basically a tax against paper products. Let's see, newspapers, for example. Think of Ben Franklin. He's the editor of a newspaper there in Philadelphia. Every morning when Ben Franklin and the guys would get the papers printed out, they'd have these young men ready to go sell the newspapers. They had to wait until a stamp collector came by. This guy would come by and he would affix a stamp to every copy of the newspaper. And every time he put a stamp on a newspaper, Ben Franklin had to give him 2 pennies. It's what's called a 2 pence or a 2 penny tax. The tax itself was not that expensive, but when you're selling newspapers in Philadelphia, those 2 pennies can add up, one copy at a time, at a time, at a time. So yeah, newspapers, you had to pay a tax. Let's see, if you got married, your marriage license, you had to pay the 2 pence tax to get the stamp put on your marriage license. Court documents, legal cases, and things like that. Even a deck of playing cards at this time. Now, they didn't put a stamp on every single card, but they did put a stamp on the entire deck, like the box that it would come in, if you will. So the Stamp Act of 1765 was a direct tax against paper products in the North American colonies. Again, the 2 pence is not that expensive. It wasn't something that was going to break the bank. But people in North America got upset about the Stamp Act because it's not right. It goes against the precedent, the idea that colonies can tax themselves, like colonial assemblies can tax the colonies, but the British Empire cannot levy direct taxes against the colonies. It flies in the face of taxation with representation. Okay, so with passage of the Stamp Act of 1765, which, by the way, King George III wanted, George Grenville's pushing it because the king wants it. Parliament makes it so. Because of this tax against the colonies themselves decide to hold a meeting, so-called Stamp Act Congress, if you will, later that year in 1765. And 9 of the 13 colonies were there, represented at the Stamp Act Congress. Now, the idea behind the Stamp Act Congress was to come together in a show of solidarity in opposition to the Stamp Act. Rather than sending like 13 different responses to this, let's try, and try is the key word, let's try to send one big voice collectively back to the British government. All right, well, at the Stamp Act Congress, 9 of the 13 colonies will meet, and these 9 colonies will state that the Stamp Act is a violation of their rights as Englishmen. So they're not talking about being Americans. They're not talking about independence. They're saying that this is a violation of their rights as Englishmen. They said that you cannot tax without representation. So that no taxation without representation battle cry comes out of this. So no taxation without representation. That's illegal. You can't do it. And at the Stamp Act Congress, they made it very clear that they would boycott British products. That is to say, they would not buy British products. They're going to boycott British products until the Stamp Act is repealed. So it violates their rights as Englishmen. It defies the idea of taxation with representation. Again, the cry becomes no taxation without representation. And unless the law is taken away, they are going to refuse to buy British products. It will be a boycott against all British products. Now, even though only 9 of 13 were there, all 13 colonies agreed to the boycott. Like even the other 4 colonies that couldn't make it, that weren't there, when they found out about what was agreed to, they also agreed. So the boycott against British products was all 13 colonies saying, we refuse to buy British stuff. All right, well, that information travels back across the Atlantic Ocean. It arrives right on into the hands of King George III. And George III's response to the Stamp Act Congress was very George III. He was angry. He said, how dare they talk to me this way? Who do they think they are? And George III basically said the law stands, the tax will be collected, and how dare you talk to your majesty that way? How dare you tell me what I can and cannot do? So on both sides of the Atlantic, in the colonies and back in England, there's this hardening of feelings. There's this animosity that brews. And as 1765 became 1766, the tax was in place. It was not repealed. In the colonies, people were not buying British products, and that was having quite an effect on the economy back in England proper. And this got nasty. And it's crazy because there was all this goodwill coming out of the French and Indian War. There was this feeling of patriotic pride there in 1763. But within 2 short years, His Majesty has lost a lot of that goodwill and a lot of that great feeling. As with this Stamp Act episode, there's a lot of mistrust being built up against him, against monarchy, against the British government. And I've always said this, the Stamp Act was something that it would never go away. It really does start that feeling of mistrust and animosity that the colonies had towards the king and the mother country. All right, well, a year passed, and then in 1766, kind of moving on to the Declaratory Act here, it was quite clear that the tax was not being paid. Colonial people just refused to pay the tax. It was also quite clear that the boycott of British products was having quite an effect on the economy. So businessmen back in England put pressure on Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. These businessmen said, look, our profits are down. This law is not even really being enforced anyway. People aren't even paying it over there. So how's about we repeal this stupid law? they'll stop boycotting our products and things can go back to normal. So it was actually economic pressure that forced the British to cave. It was these businessmen in England complaining about their profits that forced the move. So in 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. They take it away, it's gone. And in that same afternoon, like it's literally like Parliament takes up the issue of the Stamp Act, it's repealed, bang the gavel, on to the next item, which is point number 8, the Declaratory Act of 1766. Now, with the Declaratory Act of 1766, the British Empire states that it has the right to tax its citizens wherever they may live. It's really a way of the British Empire saying to the colonies, okay, you won this round, you got us. But understand going forward, we are the empire, we are in charge. If we want to tax you, we have the right to tax you. If we want to pass laws against you, we have the right to pass those laws. So the Declaratory Act is the British Empire, in a sense, declaring that it's in charge, and the colonies are subservient to the British Empire. Well, point number 9, virtual representation, is also something that Parliament took up at the same time. There were some members of Parliament, some lawyers, who said, hey, you know, the colonists are onto something here. It is illegal to tax people without representation. And there were some members of Parliament who had a problem with taxing the colonies without representation. So virtual representation was a way to make the lawyers feel good, the legal scholars feel good. And this is what virtual representation stated. It stated that Parliament, just by existing, protects the rights of Englishmen wherever they may live. You could live in Canada under British control. Parliament exists to protect your rights as an Englishman. The same applies for the colonies along the eastern seaboard. The same will apply to British colonies in India. If you are British, Parliament, by its very existence, represents you. So even though you don't vote for members of Parliament, you are virtually represented by this body. So virtual representation was a way of saying that Parliament represents all Englishmen, no matter where they may live, and that the rights of Englishmen are protected by this Parliament. Whether you vote for it or not, it represents your rights as an Englishman. So virtual representation is a way for the legal minds to be okay. Sure, you know, if we tax going forward, we can do it through virtual representation. And all that information makes its way back across the Atlantic to North America. And in the colonies, they receive the news that the Stamp Act has been repealed. They give out a big hooray, knowing that they've really won this battle. That's what mattered, right? It was repeal of the Stamp Act. The colonial response to the Declaratory Act is sort of the heck you say. You don't have the right to do these things you're saying you do. And I don't think any of them fully understood virtual representation, but they didn't really care. The people in colonial North America understood this. They won. They beat the British, they got the Parliament to cave, and the Stamp Act was repealed. All that other stuff is window dressing. The colonies understood that they won this whole Stamp Act fight by Parliament caving in and repealing the law. So there are a lot of things that happen because of the Stamp Act. It really is a huge moment. I would put a star, a rainbow, a smiley face by the Stamp Act, by the Congress, by the back and forth response. It really is a huge deal. Let's see, what did the British Empire learn from the Stamp Act? Well, the first thing they learned is, for God's sakes, don't tax those people. If you try to levy a direct tax against your colonies, you're probably going to have a revolution on your hand. So the British learned you don't tax these people, not directly anyway. What the colonies learned in this whole Stamp Act mess is unity matters. Coming together as a group matters, right? Like they're going to eventually be called the United States of America. This is a moment where they're uniting, where they're coming together, and eventually do become those United States of America. So unity matters. Strength in numbers matters. They found that out in the Stamp Act fight. The colonies also found out that economic pressure works. That if you can hit them in the pocketbook where it really counts, that'll get real change. I've always tried to also put the Stamp Act in this sort of a context. It's kind of a strange analogy, but I'm going to run with it anyways. So imagine you get hurt. I don't know, you slice your arm open in a horrible accident. You can live from that. I mean, like you're going to get rushed to the hospital, you're going to get it stitched up and everything. You can still be alive. But even after the stitches are taken off and the bandages are taken off, you're going to have a scar on your arm for the rest of your life. The Stamp Act mess is that. It's a cut. It's something that needs a stitch, needs attention. And yes, they could have repaired this relationship. I believe that. I truly do. The British could have taken steps to repair the damage that was done. But the mistrust will always be there. The goodwill feeling between the two is just simply gone. And yes, even though you can sort of stitch this up, right? You can put bandages on this situation. The scar will remain. The damage really is done. And going forward, whenever the British try to do something, it'll be seen with mistrust, misunderstanding. The colonists just don't see the British as this, I don't know, this good thing that had their back that was protecting them anymore. They start to see it as something that's out to get them, something that's up to no good. So the Stamp Act mess really does begin that feeling of mistrust on the part of the colonies towards the mother country. And that anger and that animosity, it just never would go away. And I do believe that the British could have repaired that situation. I think that they could have repaired the damage done, but they couldn't help themselves. They just kept tripping over themselves, if you will, in the decisions that they would make. All right, well, poor old George Grenville got fired for this mess. Really, all he did was what His Majesty told him to do. But you know, Grenville did believe that the colonies should pay these taxes. He did believe that the colonies should be made to pay their fair share of the debt. But in doing that, he just simply carried out the wishes of the king. But you don't fire kings, right? Not unless you have a revolution and an axe to cut off a head or something like that. So rather than fire a king, George Grenville gets fired. And in his place will be promoted this fellow by the name of Charles Turnip Townshend, the guy you see down there in the middle on our the bottom middle of our slide. And Charles Turnip Townshend was, by all accounts, a very brilliant man. He's now in charge of the Treasury for the British after the firing of Grenville. It's his job now to take on this problem with the national debt, which, by the way, didn't go away. You know, Stamp Act fights, all this stuff. There's still a debt problem there. So now it falls into the lap of Townshend to try to handle this mess. You know, Charles Townshend, his nickname was Champagne Charlie, because apparently he really liked to party. And it was part of his life. He loved to drink and he loved to have fun. And people said that he was a bit of a drunkard, a bit of an alcoholic, with that nickname Champagne Charlie. But they said, like, if you could just get him sober, he was brilliant. He knew what he was doing. He was a very sound mind when he was sober. But apparently the problem sometimes was getting him sober. But what Townshend will do, his response to all of this, is to pass what are called the Townshend duties, going on to point 10 here on our outline. And the Townshend duties were just simply more tariffs, more taxes on foreign products. He raised the rates on some of the products that were already being taxed, put tariffs on some luxury items like silks and linens and things like that. So yes, the Townshend duty is it's more tariffs, the raising on the rates of tariffs that did already exist. Look, Champagne Charlie looked at it this way. He looks at what Grenville had done before, and he says to himself, okay, well, that Revenue Act of 1764, they didn't go crazy over that. That they didn't start screaming rebellion. So we could get away with that. We could do more tariffs. That seems to work. But that Stamp Act, no, for God's sakes, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to directly tax these people. So Townshend learned from his predecessor. They accept tariffs, but they will not accept direct taxes. So yes, the Townshend duties are that. They're more tariffs on foreign products. And he and the king and the nation of England were stunned when the North American colonies screamed foul over the Townshend duties. They got upset with these new tariffs and the raising of the rates. And they didn't understand it. Why are you upset? You have accepted tariffs to this point. Why now, with the Townshend duties, are you upset and angry? Well, the difference and the problem is the Stamp Act, and they just don't trust the British anymore. And these ideas about generating revenue, they're seen as something that's evil, trying to take advantage of them. So yes, colonials in North America don't trust the British anymore, and they got mad about the raising of these tariffs under the Townshend duties. Colonial people also started to say this to the British Empire. It's basically like, you keep saying that we owe you this debt, that we should help pay our fair share of the national debt. But the thing is, this war, this French and Indian War, that all the debt came from, like, we're the ones who fought that war. Those of us who live in Virginia and in Pennsylvania, we're the ones who like volunteered to go out west and fight. We're the ones who answered the call for king and country. And look, some of our fathers and brothers and sons, they're never coming home. Like, you keep saying we owe you money, but our feeling is we've actually paid our debt. And our debt was paid with the ultimate sacrifice, the lives of our fathers and brothers and sons. So stop talking like we owe you a debt, like we owe you something. We did our part for king and country. We put our lives on the line. And many of our husbands, fathers, and sons will never come home because we paid the ultimate debt for king and country. Well, the king, Townshend, Parliament, they throw up their hands in despair with the animosity towards the Townshend duties, and they repeal most of the Townshend duties by the end of 1767. Now, I do think it's important to note this. Not all of the tariffs were taken away. A lot of them were. But one tariff in particular that stayed was the tariff on tea. And that is to say that when a foreign company was trying to sell tea in the North American colonies, they were going to have to pay that tax or that tariff as well. So most of the Townshend duties will be repealed, but the one on tea will stay in place. Later on, we're going to have a little tea party, thanks to that Townshend duty on tea still being in place. But as you look from number 10 to number 11 here on your outline, you'll see there's like this 2.5-year period of relative peace. There's not much going on, people just kind of go forward living their lives. But then there's this strange interlude there in 1770 with the Boston Massacre. I'll get to that in just a moment. But then after that strange interlude, look, there's really nothing for another 3 years. So it's like there's this 6-year window where there's this one thing that does happen. You can't deny that. But it's kind of like 5 to 6 years of relative peace in North America. And in that, the British could have done things to repair their relationship with their colonies, but they couldn't help themselves. They just kept stumbling over themselves, it seems, with each move. Okay, well, looking at number 11, the so-called massacre in Boston, there in 1770. Okay, in Boston, there were a large number of British troops stationed in that town. This wasn't true of most of the other cities in North America. There wasn't a large British troop presence in, say, New York or in any of the cities of Virginia. But here in Boston, there was this large number of troops in the city. People in Boston would often say, hey, we're not at war. Why are there so many troops in our town? Well, the answer is, quite frankly, King George III doesn't trust Boston, and he still holds a special place of hatred in his heart for that region and that area. I mean, like, these are the people who violate the Navigation Acts, who sell weapons to the French in a time of war, just show that disloyalty, those problems. You guys might remember in previous lectures I talked about how the Puritans and their descendants would always have problems with the kings going forward. And well, here we are it's 1770, And yes, King George III kept a lot of British soldiers in Boston because he just didn't trust Boston. You know, he saw it as a den of sin and rats, full of organized crime and disloyal people. So yeah, Boston did have a large number of troops there in the city. Well, along the way, there's this evening there in Boston. You have these soldiers who are garrisoned in the downtown Boston area. They're sleeping in a garrison. A garrison is where soldiers sleep, if you will. They're actually right outside of what's called a customs house, where you collect tariff revenue and taxes. And there's a couple of British soldiers there standing guard. When there's a group of people who show up, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. Now, the Sons of Liberty were a group formed in these times. They were actually formed during the Stamp Act fight. But the Sons of Liberty, this organization was a colonial organization that was founded to protect the rights of colonial Englishmen. The whole point of the Sons of Liberty was to fight for and protect your rights as an Englishman. It had chapters in every colony. The big cities had their own chapters as well. And the Boston chapter of the Sons of Liberty was headed up by a fellow by the name of Samuel Adams. Yes, he's the fellow on the beer bottle, Sam Adams beer. Samuel Adams was a troublemaker. He was a revolutionary type. And he, as a radical, was in charge of the Sons of Liberty Boston chapter. Well, these guys thought it would be sporting fun to go out and heckle the British soldiers, to protest this large troop presence there in their town. So the Sons of Liberty are heckling these two soldiers. At some point, it gets a little out of control. They start pelting them with rocks and things like that. So their lieutenant, the officer on the scene, comes out, sort of assesses the situation as trouble. We got a crowd. They're up to no good. This lieutenant orders the rest of these British soldiers to come out, put on their uniforms, gather their weapons, and stand ready there in a line. Now, this crowd started out as sort of a small crowd, but you got to think of life at that time. People in Boston heard a commotion. They heard laughter and sounds. And, there's no television to watch. There's no video games to play. So just normal people in Boston are like, well, hey, I want to have fun. I want to see what all the commotion is about. So like a crowd of 25 turns into a crowd of 50, turns into a crowd of 80. It's kind of getting bigger as it goes. And I don't know, man, if I'd been there in Boston and then these soldiers show up with rifles on their shoulders, I'm probably going to say, you know what, this has been a lot of fun, but it's getting late. I got to go to work in the morning and they got guns. So yeah, it's time to go home. I probably would have taken that attitude. But no, the crowd continued to heckle. It continued to get louder. They started throwing more than just rocks. They were throwing snowballs, ice balls. That's where you pack snow into a ball, you put it in water, you let it harden into ice, then you pack it with more snow and you throw it. It hurts when you get hit with those things. At some point, somebody threw a club of all things, a freaking club, goes flying through the air and hits one of the British soldiers on the side of his head. He falls to the ground, knocked out unconscious. He was bleeding out the side of his head, and he'd had this horrible scar on his head for the rest of his life from getting hit. But his buddies are sitting there. They see their friend is on the ground. He's knocked out. They think he's dead. They don't know he's just unconscious. But for all they know, he's dead because this thing hit him in the side of the head. This crowd is cussing. It's yelling. It's throwing things. Yeah, these British soldiers are not having a good time. In fact, they're downright tired of the whole scene. So at some point in all this, the lieutenant, he told his men to ready. What you do there is you take your rifle off your shoulder. He told them to aim. And that's where you sort of put your feet in the proper position. You raise that musket up to your shoulder. You lock it in place, ready. And he said that he did tell them to ready. He told them to aim. But the next steps are very gray. The next moments are just, who do you believe? Sorry, my dog likes to bark. The next moments are just who do you believe? Later in court, facing a judge sworn to tell the truth, the lieutenant told a judge that yes, he did tell his men to ready and aim, but that he hoped by doing that that would disperse the crowd, that would get them to see, oh wait, we could be shot at. It's time to leave. But this lieutenant swore that he never gave that order to fire, that he never told his men that word fire. That lieutenant did say that there were people in the crowd who were yelling things like, "You're cowards. You're too much of a coward. You won't fire. You won't dare fire." So there were people in the crowd who were yelling the word fire, but the lieutenant swore that he never gave that order. Is he telling the truth? I don't know. Are the people of Boston, who will call this a massacre, telling the truth when they say that he's the one who yelled fire? It's a great question. I wasn't there. We don't have like video evidence of what took place. So the order ready was given. The order aim was given. And someone said fire. Was it the lieutenant? Was it someone in that crowd? I don't know. But you're a British soldier standing there in that mess. You're getting yelled at, cussed at. Things are being thrown at you. One of your buddies could possibly be dead there on the ground. I'm sure those British soldiers were itching to pull that trigger. I'm sure they were ready to give this crowd a little taste of it. But they did hear the word fire, and fire away they do. And when the dust settles from this volley, 6 are dead, 12 are wounded, and yeah, we have people shot dead there in the streets of Boston. Now, when Samuel Adams would print the story of what happened here, in a big bold headline, he puts massacre. And Samuel Adams will categorize what happened in the streets of Boston that night as a massacre. That's where we get the title of the Boston Massacre. And that'll circulate through Boston, Massachusetts. Eventually, that story will be put in the papers in like Philadelphia, Virginia, all across North America, in the colonies anyways. And what colonial people read was this story about how these Bostonians were gathered in town hall assembly. They were just simply there to discuss their rights as Englishmen. Because, yeah, that's what you do on a really cold night in the snow, is you gather together to talk about your rights as Englishmen, right? So, yeah, Adams said that they were meeting in town hall assembly, that they had the right to assemble, and that then out of nowhere come these British brutes, telling them to disperse, telling them they can't be there, lining up in formation, ready, aim, fire, and there you have a massacre on your hands. I don't want to be too mean to Sam Adams when I say he lied, but he lied. He stretched the truth a bit in his retelling of the Boston Massacre. And using that term massacre, it's like it grabs your attention. It's a headline, right? No disrespect to those who died in Boston that night, but I think Native Americans living out west could better describe what a massacre is than the 6 who died there in Boston. But anywho, if you're George Washington, you're at your estate in Mount Vernon in Virginia, and you pick up a copy of your newspaper and you're reading about how these British brutes fired upon this peaceful crowd in Boston that had gathered in town hall assembly. And all across the colonies, people read that version. They believed that version, that it was in fact a massacre. And what people in Virginia and the Carolinas and other parts started to say was, well, why are there so many British soldiers in Boston to begin with? Hasn't the war with France been over for quite some time? Why are there so many soldiers in Boston anyways? And it just lent credence to that idea that this king he can be a tyrant. He's not necessarily looking out for our best interests. And it's just one more reason to be mistrustful of the British. The fact that they fired upon this crowd of people and that they had so many soldiers stationed there in Boston. By the way, after this incident, there was a trial called for there in the city of Boston. These British soldiers were going to be put on trial for murder. And these men needed a lawyer. They needed some legal representation. But there wasn't a lawyer in the Boston area that was going to take that case. Every lawyer in Boston knew that if you took that case, the Sons of Liberty would probably pay you a visit. You know, these fine, upstanding young men who stand for your rights as Englishmen, they'll probably beat you up. They'll probably do some sort of physical punishment against you if you try to take on this case and represent those soldiers. But there was one lawyer in Boston who argued that these men deserved a fair trial. And, you know, hey, if they're found guilty, they're guilty. If they're found innocent, that should stand. But John Adams was a lawyer there in Boston who agreed to take on this case to represent these British soldiers. Now, John Adams, who's going to go on to be the first Vice President of the United States, he's going to be part of the Declaration of Independence. He goes on to be the second President of the United States. John Adams was cousins with Samuel Adams. And John would later recall that he didn't think his cousin would do any harm to him. And he was right. The Sons of Liberty didn't come after him or hurt him or anything. But John Adams, in defending those British soldiers, he actually did a very good job of defending them. And he had them acquitted of all the charges of murder. So there you go with John Adams stepping up and believing in the right to a fair trial and all that. All right, then you can see it's relative peace for a few more years. But then we get to the Tea Act of 1773, and again, the British just cannot help themselves. They'll keep putting their foot in their mouth. So let's look at what happened here with this Tea Act of 1773. All right, the central figure in the Tea Act of 1773 is something called the British East India Trading Company. The British East India Trading Company is our central figure in the Tea Act of 1773. And just as I told you, you should put a star, a rainbow, or a smiley face next to the Stamp Act and everything that happened because of that, I would also put rainbows, stars, and smiley faces next to the Tea Act because this is a big moment in the coming of the revolution as well. I've always told my students this is the on-ramp, right? We're getting off of the service road and we're on the on-ramp to the highway that is the American Revolution with the Tea Act of 1773. Okay, well, the British East India Trading Company is based out of India. It happens to be located in East India. And this company does all manner of things. It produces tea out of India to sell worldwide. It sells tobacco. Here's a truth, it sold slaves as well, not out of India, but out of Africa. The British East India Trading Company was in many ways like the UPS of its time. It traded products all over God's green earth. But specific to our story, let's stick to our story, right? In 1772, there had been a drought in India. So tea didn't quite make the way they were hoping that year. The company's profits were down a little bit because of the drought, because of the lack of tea. But then in 1773, the rains came back. They produced a lot of tea in India there in 1773. So the British East India Company is looking for a way to rebound that year, to get its profits back up and to try to sell more tea. So the British East India Company approached the British Parliament with ideas for how to get its profits up in 1773. I do think it's important to note that there were high-ranking members of the British Parliament who were invested in the British East India Trading Company. So these lawmakers, by helping this company, they're helping their own profits, right? They're helping their own pocketbook. Well, anyways, to cut to the chase, the Tea Act of 1773 essentially waives the tariff on tea for this company and this company alone. What the Tea Act of 1773 does is it basically states that when the British East India Company, Trading Company, sells its tea in the colonies, it does not have to pay the tariff. All the other foreign tea companies still have to pay the tariff, but it is waived for the benefit of this one company, the British East India Trading Company. When Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, they broke out into clapping and celebrations. They patted each other on the back, and members of parliament said, "The colonies are going to love us for this. We're giving them a great tea at a reduced price." Some members of parliament literally said this. They will throw tea parties in our honor over there because we're giving them this great tea at a reduced price. Well, Parliament thought that it had done a great thing for the company and for the colonies. This will help the British East India Trading Company get its profits up. They'll sell more tea. The people living in colonial America will be appreciative of getting a really good tasting tea at a cheaper rate. And they were right that we did throw parties. I don't necessarily know that those parties were in their honor. But when news of all this reaches the North American colonies, they're not really celebrating. They're not much in a fun, festive mood. They're actually very upset with the passage of the Tea Act of 1773. And again, I just want to say this one more time. The Stamp Act causes the mistrust, the uneasy feelings, so that when a Tea Act is passed, it's not seen as a positive thing. It's really seen as, okay, what are they up to now? Now what are they trying to do to us? How are they trying to screw us over now? The colonies said it's not right. If you want to waive the tariff on tea, waive it for all companies. But it's not right that you're just doing it to the benefit of this one company. It's the British Empire choosing favorites. And you know what? This time it's a tea company. What if next year it's a company that makes molasses? And they just get to kind of cherry pick which companies they want to favor. Also in North America, they said, this could lead to the formation of monopolies, where this one company sort of takes over the entire tea market here in North America. So they didn't see this as a good move. They saw it as unfair, that it wasn't right. When British East India ships tried to pull into New York to offload their cargo of tea, riots broke out in New York. The ships were pelted with rocks and all manner of things. Those ships couldn't park in New York City. They had to go further up the Hudson River and find another place to park. Same thing happened in Philadelphia. Riots broke out, and the people of Philadelphia wouldn't allow the ships to land. So you figure when those British East India vessels come pulling into Boston, it's like, I don't know, it's like a war is going to break out, like an atomic bomb's going to go off or something. And it's just going to be a swath of destruction there in the city. But actually, when those ships came pulling into Boston, it was very quiet. Nothing was happening at all. There was no resistance to the ships being allowed to land. The ship captains thought it was odd that nothing really happened as the ships landed. And at first, they kept the crews aboard the ships. They were worried that something might happen. But it started to get dark, and the ship captains told their crew, okay, it looks like everything's okay. You guys go on into town, get a hot meal and a bath and all that. And they left the ships relatively unprotected there in the harbor in Boston that night. Nothing had happened during the day. They figured nothing would happen at all. But then that night, as the sun went down, a group of fine, upstanding young citizens calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Native Americans, walked down to the harbor in Boston, got aboard each of those British East India Company ships, brought all the tea up to the top deck. It was in these boxes. And they had tomahawks. They played it all the way. But the tomahawks weren't just for show. They actually worked. And using tomahawks, they busted open the crates of tea, dumped every stinking leaf of tea out of those boxes into the ocean, into the harbor, and destroyed a small king's ransom's worth of property that night in the Boston harbor. So the so-called Boston Tea Party was an act of defiance against the British East India Company, against the Tea Act, and what the British were up to. They destroyed a lot of tea that night in the Boston harbor. In the days that followed this incident, the authorities were going around asking people, do you know who did this? Can you help us with this case? And Bostonians, almost to a man, said, well, it was a tribe of Native Americans that did that. I'd never seen the tribe myself, they would say. They would dress kind of strange, but yeah, it was Indians what did that. Nobody gave up the Sons of Liberty because they knew if you snitched, if you were a rat, they'd pay you a visit. And it wouldn't be fun when the Sons of Liberty paid you a visit. Truth be told, the authorities knew who it was anyways. They were just trying to get witnesses to help out. So this Tea Party takes place. There's the destruction of this property in the harbor. Bostonians would laugh about it for years to come. These guys who were involved would laugh about it for the rest of their lives. It was a party. It was a good night. It was so much fun. But the news of this goes back across the Atlantic Ocean to England. King George III finds out what's happened here in Boston. And his reaction is a very angry reaction. His thinking is, of course, it's Boston. The den of rats and sin, the people who violate the Navigation Acts, sell weapons to the French during a time of war, where the so-called massacre took place. Of course, it's Boston that has carried out this act of defiance and destroyed all that property, all that tea. I would argue that in these moments, King George III let his emotions get the better of him. And this is so George III. Rather than punish those responsible for the Tea Party, he decides to punish all of Massachusetts for what's taken place. And His Majesty's reaction to the Boston Tea Party will be to pass the Coercive Acts. You can see here point number 14, the Coercive or Intolerable Acts. In England, they were referred to as the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they're referred to as the Intolerable Acts. That is to say, we can't tolerate these laws. All right, well, with the Coercive Acts, King George III is going to punish all of Massachusetts rather than the Sons of Liberty and the people who dumped the tea into the ocean. All right, so here we go with the Coercive Acts. Let's see. One of the Coercive Acts was that government in Massachusetts was completely suspended, except for the position of the governor. So there will be no council. There will be no colonial assembly. The only government that exists in Massachusetts is the governor. And if you'll recall, we've talked about this previously. The governor is handpicked by the king. The governor is like the king's man there in the colony. So he suspends all government in Massachusetts, except for his handpicked guy, the governor. Let's see, another coercive act will be the closing of the port of Boston. The British will not allow anything to land in Boston, nor will they allow anything to leave Boston. So the port of Boston is closed. The British actually said that they would reopen the port if the good people of Massachusetts would pay for the lost tea. But until the tea was paid for, the port of Boston would remain closed. Well, that port of Boston will be remaining closed for about a decade, all the way through the American Revolution. All right, so that's a second coercive act, closing the port of Boston. That right there, that's huge. That's crippling to the economy of that region. Not just Massachusetts, but all of New England. Most of the trade that went in and out of the colonies, especially up in the Northeast, it went through the city of Boston. So that's going to have a huge damaging effect on the economy up there in the Northeast. Okay, the last of the coercive acts that I care to talk about, there are several, but I just look at a handful, is referred to as the Quartering Act. Spelled like the coin, quarter. But to offer someone quarter is not to offer them 25 cents. To offer someone quarter is to offer them shelter. Quarter is you come in from the rain, the storm, the elements. You allow someone to sleep in your home. So giving someone quarter is to give them shelter. Well, under the Quartering Act, this law gave the British military the right to take over people's homes in Massachusetts for the quartering of their soldiers. So the British Army could be marching out in the Massachusetts countryside. It's getting late. Their boys need a place to sleep. So the British Army could literally knock on your door at, 11 o'clock at night, tell you to get the heck out of your home because the soldiers were going to be staying there for the night. So the Quartering Act allowed the British military to take over people's homes and allow their soldiers to sleep in those homes. Now, I bring up the Quartering Act for this reason. The Quartering Act is proof that George III knew that war was coming. Really, his approach at this point is to crush a rebellion in Massachusetts. Again, I got to make this point. The coercive acts did not apply to the other colonies. This isn't about Georgia or Virginia or New York. The coercive acts are just about Massachusetts. That colony is going to be punished for what happened at the Tea Party. So it really is with the Quartering Act, what you have to say is George III knows he's sending his military to Massachusetts. He knows that he's going to be fighting rebels in the Massachusetts countryside. So the Quartering Act is proof that King George III knew what he was doing. He was trying to crush a rebellion there in Massachusetts. All right, well, the coercive acts are sent across the ocean. They eventually arrive in Boston. And the people of Massachusetts and Boston are informed that their government is suspended, except for the governor. The port of Boston is closed until the tea could be paid for. And the British military can take over their homes as they please for the quartering of soldiers. Massachusetts obviously did not like these laws. The people of Massachusetts are very upset. And just imagine being like some farmer in the backcountry of Massachusetts. You live out near Lexington. And some knuckleheads got aboard a boat and threw some tea in the water. And now you got to face all these penalties because of the actions of those knuckleheads. I bet it made a lot of those Massachusetts farmers upset that they were all being punished for the actions of a few. But I think what's even more important is that as news began to circulate about these laws, again, it's only about Massachusetts. But when people in Virginia heard about these laws, they were upset, as were people in the Carolinas, Pennsylvania, and on it goes. And like all the other colonies disagreed with this move. All the other colonies were upset at the British Empire for what they were doing here. The laws may have just been aimed at Massachusetts, but all the other colonies were just as fighting mad about what was taking place. So another meeting was called for, another Congress. Remember, we had a Stamp Act Congress in the face of the Stamp Act. Well, now in the face of the coercive acts, we're going to hold what's called the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in the fall of 1774. The Stamp Act Congress, it worked, right? So we're going to try that again, come together, show unity, and tell the British collectively as a group that we don't like the coercive acts. Okay, well, at the First Continental Congress, 12 of 13 colonies were represented. Georgia really wanted to be there, but it was getting a little late in the season, and they wouldn't be able to arrive on time. But I can also tell you that Georgia would eventually agree to everything that was said at the First Continental Congress. So 12 of 13 are represented, but it might as well be all 13 that are there. So they're getting better at unifying, right? They're getting better at coming together. It had been 9 at the Stamp Act Congress, and now we're doing 12 at the First Continental Congress. All right, well, at the First Continental Congress, collectively, the colonies say that the coercive acts are a violation of their rights as Englishmen. There you go again. We're not Americans yet. We're not using that language. They're still loyal British subjects, but the coercive acts are a violation of their rights as Englishmen. They called upon King George III to repeal the coercive acts as a violation of their rights as Englishmen. And they said that if the coercive acts were not repealed, that they would boycott British products and refuse to buy. So again, they're going back to what's tried and true, what had worked before. With this, they call for a boycott of British products until the coercive acts are repealed. At the First Continental Congress, they also called upon every colony to begin to form militia units and train for the possibility of a war. Now, they weren't looking for a fight. They would really rather resolve this peacefully. But this is a case of just making plans, being prepared. That they called upon every colony to form a militia and to begin to prepare for the possibility of a war. in Virginia. A gentleman by the name of George Washington will form that colony's militia. George Washington will start to train that Virginia militia for the possibility of a coming war. So there's that at the First Continental Congress as well, the calling for militia. All right, well, those gentlemen send their message across the Atlantic to good old King George III. They hope that they'll listen to his calls, his pleas. And as those guys were leaving Philadelphia there in the fall of 74, they made a pledge, an agreement, that all of them would come back in the spring of 1775. That, like, no matter what had transpired in the wintertime, all of them would meet again in Philadelphia to reassess the situation in the spring of 1775. That'll go on to be known as the Second Continental Congress when they all come back that next spring. So they left Philadelphia in the fall of 74. It was starting to get cold. They wanted to get home to their families before the roads became muddy and impassable. So as those men left Philadelphia and made that pact to come back the next spring, they didn't know it, but their lives were about to completely change. I've always said I hope that those guys really enjoyed the holidays of 1774, like it was a great Christmas, you know? It was a great New Year's. That they really cherished that time with their families. Because when these guys came back in the spring of 75, everything changed. The war was becoming real. The situation was getting more desperate. And for some of those guys, like, they wouldn't see their families for a long time to come. John Adams, from that point forward, he rarely got to see his wife, Abigail, like for the next 10 years. George Washington didn't see Martha Custis Washington, for quite some time. So I really hope that the holidays of 1774 were something special, because when these guys came back in the spring of 1775, everything had changed. The whole situation was something new. And that leads us to the next thing to look at, which is Lexington and Concord, point number 16. And with this, you have the opening shots of the American Revolution here at Lexington and Concord. Okay, in that winter of 74 becoming 75, the British were starting to amass a large army in Boston. With each passing day, more and more soldiers were arriving. And what the British were doing is they were building up their forces, and they were preparing to go out against militias and against the Sons of Liberty type groups, rebels, if you will, in that spring of 1775. Excuse me while my chair squeaks. Again, I apologize. So this is if ever there was a war that spies played a role, it's the American Revolution. Everybody had spies. Both sides did, Americans and the British. But American spies were keeping an eye on British movements within Boston. They were sort of keeping an eye on when would the British start marching, and things like that. So that when it got to be April, and the weather was better, springtime, the grass was green, the sun was out, the birds were singing and things like that. I don't know what it is about April, but so many wars in human history have started in April. I think it's, you've been sitting around all winter, you can't do anything. But then spring rolls around and it's time to just unleash that anger, right? The sky is blue, the grass is green, and it's just a great time to go out and kill your fellow man in April. But April rolls round, and the British decide that it's time to make their moves to strike, if you will. Now, British spies had it on good authority that two colonial rebels were hanging out in the city of Lexington. Samuel Adams and a gentleman by the name of John Hancock were hiding out in Lexington. Now, he talked a little bit about Sam Adams as the leader of the Sons of Liberty. John Hancock was a merchant. He was into shipping and things like that. He was a very wealthy man. And it's kind of like Sam Adams was the brains and Hancock was the money of this little operation. But anyway, the Brits had it on good authority that those two guys were hanging out in Lexington. So the plan was to get an early start, try to march on Lexington and capture those two rebels, ask them a handful of questions, and then hang them from the nearest tree they could find there in Lexington. But the British also had it on good authority that just a few more miles down the road in the city of Concord, this is where Massachusetts rebels were hiding their weapons, shot, powder, muskets, and things like that. So the plan for the British that fateful April day, April the 18th, 1775, was to start out early in the morning, march on Lexington, capture and hang a couple of rebels, then march on to Concord and capture and destroy the weapons that they're hiding. And the British thought they could have it all done within, say, a day or two, march back to Boston, and all would be better. So on April the 18th, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, British troops started marching out of Boston. And immediately as British troops were on the march, the spies kicked in. You can see here we have these three different routes in green, red, and blue. I'm sorry, in blue and green, sorry, of these routes that these spies would take. And this is the whole Paul Revere's ride, you know, the British are coming, the British are coming. One if by land, two if by sea. But these spies go out and send the word that the British are on the march. So that by the time the British do reach Lexington, Adams and Hancock have been alerted. They actually skedaddle and get the heck out of town before the British arrive. So those guys will be long out of the situation, long gone. Okay, but the British march upon Lexington, and as they arrive in Lexington, as chance would have it, there was some militia training going on there in the city that morning. And militia training was kind of like this. These guys would gather together. They would fire at targets for a little bit, target practice. Then they'd commence to drinking some ale, fire at some targets some more, maybe work on marching, you know, about face and things like that. But drinking beer was a big part of this militia training. Well, some of them were into the beer drinking phase of militia training that morning as the British come marching into Lexington. You've got these Massachusetts farm boys, these militia types. They got guns, they've got beer. That doesn't mix very well, right? Beer muscles and testosterone with weapons involved. That can be a bad scene. So one British officer in particular didn't care for this. He saw weapons, he saw alcohol. So this one British officer sort of pulls out of the line as the British Army's marching into town. He takes with him a handful of soldiers and says, "Hey, come with me." And this British officer marches over to where these militia guys are standing, and he basically tells them to stand down, to drop their weapons. Look, that you're drinking beer is whatever, but that you have the guns, that's the problem. And I see how you guys are eyeballing us. I can see the anger in your eyes. So, hey, boys, if you want to go drink, have at it, but put down the guns. Well, beer muscles kicked in as the Massachusetts militia boys straighten up and say, well, who the heck are you to tell me what to do? I live here. I have the right to gather with my friends in this militia. We have the right to own these guns. My question is, who are you? And who do you think you are to come here to my town? So there's this back and forth. There's testosterone and alcohol involved. As a British officer is trying to get these guys to put down their guns. And here's another situation where history goes gray. It's just a matter of who do you want to believe. But somebody fired a shot there at Lexington. A lot of people who were there that day said that it was shot from a nearby tavern. That somebody shot a musket from a window outside of a tavern. Maybe that's true. Other people who were there that day said that it was the British who fired first, that a British soldier fired his gun first. It really sucks. It'd be nice to know who fired that first shot there on the Lexington Green, because that is referred to as the shot heard round the world. And truth be told, the shot heard round the world was probably fired by a drunken fool. We can't prove that. But that shot heard round the world ushers in the Revolutionary Age. We recognize it as the first shot fired in the American Revolution, which is going to have a big hand in triggering the French Revolution. It's going to have a massive hand in triggering the revolutions of Europe in the 1800s, and on it goes. So the Revolutionary Age is born here on Lexington Green in Massachusetts as somebody fired the first shot of the American Revolution. Well, when that shot got fired, a lot of those militia boys sobered up real fast. They got big looks in their eyes, and it's kind of a chaotic scene of running away, firing your gun as you run away. Meanwhile, the British, very professional, highly trained, they form a line. It's called a phalanx. They are told, ready, aim, fire. And they fire at these militia guys as they're running away. If you get hit, there's some casualties there at Lexington. But I've always referred to what happened at Lexington as drunken chaos, an accident. But it's real. The war is on. It started with the firing of these shots here at Lexington. The British go on to the town itself. They kick down doors. They look in attics and basements. They never do find Hancock or Adams again. They're long gone, having been warned. But after spending a little time in the city of Lexington and not finding the rebels that they wanted, the British form ranks. The British march down the path, and now they're headed on to Concord to try to confiscate those weapons. Well, our militia, our farmer boys who ran away from Lexington afraid for their lives, they didn't go home crying to their mamas. In fact, what most of them did is they went and they told their friends, their buddies, that the war had started. And all across the back country of Massachusetts, you got a bunch of riled up hillbillies who are ready to go off to war. And they're saying, look, I'm not kidding, man. They fired at us. Grab your gun, let's go. And what all these farm boys across the back country of Massachusetts are doing is they're organizing. They're gathering their friends and their weapons, and they're heading to the city of Concord, because that's where the powder and the shot is. That's where a lot of weapons that you need to fight back with are located. So all the hillbillies of Massachusetts are headed to Concord, which also happens to be the location that the British are marching to, the city of Concord. So their destinies, if you will, were to meet out there at the battlefield at Concord. Well, the British Army, as it marched down the road, the combat is very strange in this period of time. They wore red coats. You can kind of see down there on the bottom right-hand side of our slide. At the Battle of Concord, on the left-hand side of the painting, you've got the militia guys. They're not wearing the same color of uniforms, a sort of a ragtag group of men. What they're shooting at is a bunch of guys dressed in red. And that was the uniform of the British Army, those big, thick, heavy red coats. It didn't matter if it was summer or winter. Those boys wore those red coats. And they stuck out like a sore thumb as they marched along the way. There's no thought of camouflage at this time or blending in with the surroundings, right? Well, not only are they wearing red, which sticks out against green grass and blue sky, but they also march to the beat of a drum. You got pipers piping and drums playing, and they would drum because it helped the guys keep that tune, keep in step and march. So not only could you see the British Army coming from a mile away, you could hear it coming from a mile away as well. And as the British Army drummed and marched its redcoat way from Lexington toward Concord, it made itself an easy target along that road. What happened is the British were harassed all the way from Lexington to Concord. Sharpshooters, snipers, if you will, would pop out of the tree line suddenly and fire a shot right into the ranks of the British Army. And they very quickly get back into the trees, run a little further down the path using the trees as cover, all the while reloading their musket, preparing to fire another shot. Then they'd rest against the trees. They'd wait. Eventually, here would come the British again, jump out and fire another shot. So they were harassed by sharpshooters all afternoon long, the British, as they marched from Lexington to Concord. Well, I've never been shot at, and good Lord willing, I can go through this life without ever having been shot at. But I've heard from people who have been in combat that it's a very harrowing experience to be shot at. Your adrenaline kicks in. They talk about how when the fight is over with, you're just thirsty. You want water. Like you're amped up. You're just go, go, go. Your energy's up high. And like by the time a firefight is over with, you're tired. You need water. You know, you want to rest. It's quite an ordeal being in combat. So imagine you're in the British Army and you've just been fired upon. You know, they had to stop marching, form a defensive rank, and just kind of sit there and just wait for a possible attack. This could take 5 to 10 minutes as they just sat there, guns ready, waiting for an attack. Now, eventually, they realize they're not being attacked full scale. They form back into a line. They start to march again. They beat the drums. The pipers are piping. And then it happens again, I don't know, 20 more minutes down the road, you get shot at. You got to form a defensive line. You got to wait for a possible attack. And like by the time the British Army got to Concord, those boys were tired. I mean, it was tea time. It was nap time by the time they reached Concord. But on a bridge on the outskirts of the town itself, the Redcoats were surprised to find that there was a large gathering of militiamen waiting for them outside of Concord. The Massachusetts farm boys had rallied together. They had powder, they had shot. And Concord was a real battle. Lexington was a drunken accident, something. Concord was a full-scale legitimate battle. And at Concord, the Massachusetts farm boys stood their ground. They fired repeatedly into the ranks of the British. They kept firing away. They didn't stop. At some point, the exhausted and tired British troops realized that they couldn't keep this up. So they had to retreat. They had to march away. And as that British army fell apart, it turned into chaos. The British, in many cases, were running for their lives. The militiamen kept following them, by the way. They wouldn't give it up. They followed the British down the roads. They kept firing at them all along the way. Oh, by the way, those sharpshooters in the tree line, when they saw the British running their way, they fired some shots as well. So what happened at Concord was a disaster for the British Army, as it was soundly defeated by the Massachusetts militia there at the Battle of Concord. All right, well, the British Army, what's left of it anyway, eventually comes marching back into Boston. As its commanding officer reports to the generals, he says, you ain't gonna believe this. Yeah, we didn't capture those rebels at Lexington. They were gone. And yeah, we didn't get those weapons at Concord either. They fought back. We faced a militia unit at Concord, and those rebels fought. They didn't give it up, and we were defeated. We were forced to run to retreat. Yeah, with that, there's no turning back. With that, you have the start of the American Revolution. The British, they are very resolved going forward. Once they hear of the setbacks at Concord, it makes them angry more than anything else. And the British just dedicate themselves to squashing this rebellion and ending what's happening here in Massachusetts. And you should understand, all of this is only about Massachusetts. The British are only fighting in that colony. They don't want this war to spread somewhere else. This is just simply about Massachusetts and trying to end a rebellion within that colony. All right, well, word spreads among the other colonies of the victory at Concord. Spring of 75 rolls around and the Second Continental Congress meets again in Philadelphia. And as the Second Continental Congress met, all of the talk was of war. All of the talk was of what had happened at Concord. And at the Second Continental Congress, some very big decisions were made. Decision number one that was made at the Second Continental Congress was to say that they stood with Massachusetts. That even though it was only Massachusetts that was being fired upon, all the other colonies stood with her in a united front. Again, the Carolinas don't have to make this stand. Virginia doesn't have to stand with Massachusetts. But all 13 colonies agree to stand united together in the face of what's happening in Massachusetts. So that's one thing at the Second Continental Congress. They make it very clear they are united. They stand together as one. At the Second Continental Congress, they also agreed that it was war, that the king had not repealed the coercive acts, that it was very obvious that this would continue to go on. So at the Second Continental Congress, all 13 colonies agreed to go to war with the British Empire. Well, last I checked, if you're going to fight a war, you need a military. And that meant that they needed to create an army. It would go on to be called the Continental Army after roughly the next year. Then in 1776, when we would declare independence, it'll become the U.S. Army. But at first, it'll be called the Continental Army here in 1775. A good question at that point was, who would lead this army? Well, John Hancock, the merchant, right, the money guy that I talked about previously, he really wanted this. In fact, he was trying to pay people money if they would support him in becoming the commanding officer of the Continental Army. But you know, when those guys met in Philadelphia and they talked about this, there was really only one true logical choice to be the leader of the Continental Army, and that was George Washington. In an age when most men stood about 5'10", George Washington just towered over people at 6'3". He was big, strong, barrel-chested. He just exuded confidence. He exuded leadership. And you know, Washington really, he was a man of few words. That's not to say he was dumb, because I promise you he was not. But George Washington was this kind of a guy who, when he walks into the room, all eyes are on him. He commands the room. He has this presence, this aura about him. He was just a natural born leader of men. He had served in the military during the French and Indian War. He had more combat experience than any of those other guys there at Philadelphia. So when it came time to choose the leader of the Continental Army, the logical choice was to go with George Washington. Once they chose Washington to be the leader of the Continental Army, he thanked them for their confidence, and he excused himself. He went back home to Virginia to gather some things, to get the Virginia militia up and running as well. And really, at that point, all George Washington has to do is recruit an army from all across the colonies, train and prepare said army to go to war, and basically take a group of ragtag farm boys who are used to shooting at squirrels and such, and mold them and train them into a professional army that could go up against the most powerful nation on earth at this time, the British Empire. No big deal, right? Yeah, not too much to ask of old George Washington here in 1775. So they do pick a commander of the Continental Army. George Washington is going to go on to lead that charge. Just real quick, they did create a navy as well at the Second Continental Congress. But man, the Continental Navy, later the U.S. Navy, it had a tough start, man. By the time the Revolution comes to an end, the U.S. Navy has about 16 what you would call ships of war, big ships with cannons. At the same time, the British have something in the neighborhood of 600 ships of war. So, yeah, you do the math. Our Navy didn't stand much of a chance in this conflict. And truth be told, our Navy was the French Navy. When the French get involved in this war, we rely heavily on their Navy to fight that side of the combat. All right, so there's a Continental Army, there's a Continental Navy established at the Second Continental Congress. Here at the Second Continental Congress, they once again called upon King George III to repeal the coercive acts. They sent to him something called the Olive Branch Petition. It's point number 18 there on the outline. And in the Olive Branch Petition, they made it very clear that if His Majesty would repeal the coercive acts and stop this war, they would lay their weapons down and continue to be loyal British subjects. But until those things happened, they were going to continue to fight for their rights as Englishmen. So in the Second Continental Congress and in the Olive Branch Petition, they're still British. They're calling upon the king to repeal these laws, the Course of Acts, that is, and to stop this fighting. And if he'll do that, they will lay their weapons down, and they will continue to be loyal British subjects. But until that takes place, they'll continue to fight for their rights as Englishmen. So in 1775, the colonial attitude is, we're still loyal, we're still British, but we're fighting for our rights as Englishmen. It's fascinating that a year later, in 1776, they would totally change their minds. They would have a new attitude. In 1775, they were still loyal British subjects. But then later in 1776, they would go for independence. And they would start calling themselves Americans in the summer of 1776. Okay, looking at the letter D here, a conservative revolution with a question mark. I used to spend some time here kind of going back and forth with students about this, but this is a recorded lecture, so we can't really do that. But I'll just go ahead and give it to you. Yes, this was a conservative revolution. This revolution was led by adult white male property holders to preserve their adult white male property holding world. And I will prove that to be true in lectures to come. Because when the revolution is over with, there was a chance to give everyone the right to vote if they wanted to. But even when the revolution is over, it'll still only be adult white male property holders who have the vote, who hold public office, who have power. So this really is a conservative revolution. They weren't really looking to change the world. They were looking to preserve their way of life, their adult white male property holding way of life. But anyway, I'll prove that as we go along, that this was in fact a conservative revolution. But if this revolution did have any sort of liberal aspects to it, it definitely would be the Declaration of Independence. So as we start looking at changes that come about because of the war, let's start by looking here at the Declaration of Independence. All right, this story of the Declaration of Independence isn't just the story of July 1776. There's a little bit of a background to it. We kind of got to, get to that point of declaring revolution. And really, in looking at the Declaration of Independence, there's one guy who plays a very prominent role, not just Thomas Jefferson, but another man named Thomas, in looking at Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine was a troublemaker. He really was. He's a radical revolutionary type. He was born and raised back in England. He lived in England for a good chunk of his life. But as a troublemaker back in England, he hated the monarchy. He committed sedition. That's where you criticize your government. It got him into some trouble back in England a time or three. So Thomas Paine decides to move to the colonies, to come to North America. And what better place for a radical to arrive than revolutionary America, circa 1775 going into 1776. All right, Thomas Paine, I think more than anything, what he is he's a fresh set of eyes. He's not a colonial. He hasn't been raised in this part of the world. He's from England, but he's offering an Englishman's perspective, an Englishman from England's perspective on these events. Well, in a series of articles that were published in newspapers across the colonies, he made this argument in what comes to be called common sense. It first started out as newspaper articles, would later be bound into book form. But in common sense, Thomas Paine is making an argument for independence. He's making an argument for the colonies to break away from the British Empire. And these are the basic arguments that Thomas Paine makes. First of all, he says that King George III is a tyrant. He tells the people living in the colonies, this man does not deserve your loyalty or your love. He's a brute. He's a tyrant. So this king is no good, is what he's telling the people living in the colonies. He says, look, this is the one guy who could stop this war, but it hasn't stopped as far as I can see. In fact, if anything, it's getting worse. So yeah, there you go. Thomas Paine is making the argument that the king is a tyrant. He also made the argument that the colonies would be better off economically without the British Empire. He says, no, look, you've got northern colonies that manufacture products. You got southern colonies that produce raw resources. You got your own financial banks and epicenters. He says, hey, you guys would be better off economically without the British on your back. The British have been holding you back economically, is the argument that he will make. Remember we talked about how the British were trying to stop colonial manufacturing from developing? Like if you made a product out of wool, you could only sell it in the colony in which it was produced. And he's right about that. I mean, mercantilism is controlled trade, and these people don't really get to decide who they sell their products to. They don't get to sell their products to the highest bidder. So he's right. Financially speaking, these colonials would be much better off without this mercantilistic system they had to live under. And the last statement I care to discuss, there's several more, but we'll just get 3 examples here. But Thomas Paine also says that you're a country already. You just haven't woke up to that fact. You already are a nation. When some trouble hits, you meet in a Congress to discuss the response and what you're going to do. You have a continental army. You have a continental navy. You have a Congress that meets. Yeah, you're a nation already. You really just haven't yet woke up to that fact. So in common sense, he's making the argument that the king is a tyrant. Economically, the British have held the colonies back. And really, you're a nation already. You just haven't woke up to that fact. Now, when Paine first published these articles, people were upset. They said, no, the king is not a tyrant. Who is this knucklehead to be making these crazy comments? They're still saying we're loyal British subjects. We're just fighting for our rights as Englishmen. But as 1775 became 1776, the war wasn't stopping anytime soon. In fact, the war was now going to other areas. It was no longer just in Massachusetts. It was being fought in other colonies as well. New York would be attacked, for example. So this war isn't ending. In fact, it's escalating. So this Paine guy might be onto something about our king. He's not stopping this war. He really is a tyrant as he continues to escalate this conflict. So if Thomas Paine is right about the king being a tyrant, could he be right about the other points that he had made? People thought about it and they realized, you know what? Yeah, if we didn't have controlled trade, if we could sell our products anywhere we pleased, we would be better off economically than we are under the British. So he's right about the first point. He's right about the second point. Wow, could he be right about the third? Could we already be a nation? And we just haven't woke up to that fact. So I've always tried to put it like this. Thomas Paine, through common sense, got the colonists to the point of declaring independence. Like he's building that argument, that case. He's getting them to that moment to make that big, huge leap to go forward with forming a new nation. On to the next point, letter B, natural law, and John Locke. You might recall I mentioned this fellow named John Locke, the guy here in the middle bottom of our slide. The English philosopher who defended the Glorious Revolution. He came up with this concept of natural law, which we now just simply call Lockean theory, with the idea being that the point of government is to protect people's life, liberty, and property, and that if government becomes destructive of those things, it's the duty of the people to get rid of that government. So that natural law concept, that Lockean theory was out there. I promise you, Thomas Jefferson read it. He knew his Locke. So Thomas Paine plays a big role in getting the colonies to the point of declaring independence. They are agreeing in the concepts of Lockean theory. George III has become destructive of our life, liberty, and property. So it's a big part of the leap, of the jump towards a declaration of independence. There on the bottom right-hand side of our slide, you can see this is the Continental Congress meeting to discuss said Declaration of Independence. Of the men standing up in front of that desk, on the left-hand side front of the desk. Thomas Jefferson is the taller of the group. Ben Franklin is on Jefferson's left, your right. John Adams is standing there on Jefferson's right, your left. And it really is Jefferson who wrote the Declaration of Independence. But he did have help from Franklin, Adams, and others. And there they are presenting the document to the Continental Congress. The guy standing up on the other side of the desk is John Hancock. He's the presiding officer over the Continental Congress. And once it is accepted, Hancock is the first guy to sign it. He was very proud. He signed real big, his name John Hancock. And anytime someone says, give me your John Hancock, they're talking about sign something, because he signed it so big and so bold. But in this document, it's more than just a Declaration of Independence. Jefferson is talking about the concepts of equality and individualism. That's letter C. And he's also putting forward some very liberal ideas for 1776. Now, you don't have to write this down. Please don't start writing this. I promise you, you can Google search the Declaration of Independence. But I've always sort of liked going over this part, especially what's underlined there within the document. All right, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And what Jefferson's saying there is if you have half a functioning brain, this ought to make sense to you. This is self-evident. This is pretty clear. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And there's your equality part. All men are created equal. That's a fascinating thing for a Virginia slaveholder to say, believing that all men are created equal. Now, in Jefferson's time, what a man was defined as, what a man was considered to be, was an adult white male property holder. And he didn't put that in there. He could have said, that all adult white male property holding men are created equal. He could have put that, but he left those adjectives out. And historians have spilled a lot of ink on this point. What did he mean by men? Was he talking about all human beings? Was he just talking about adult white male property holders? I left it kind of vague there. Did he mean to leave it vague? Did he know that in the future we would get over ourselves and, stop judging people based on gender and race and things like that? That's a good question. Did he mean all of humanity? Or did he just mean adult white males, and rich ones at that? There he is calling for equality, this idea that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So just being born a human being, whoever created you, God, but whoever created you, gives you these rights, and that just being born into the human race, you are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the pursuit of happiness is that individualism that comes out in the document. Why didn't he just say property? Why didn't he go with what Locke had said before? He's really trying to make the argument that the whole point of government is to protect our life, protect our rights or liberties, and to set up an avenue by which people can be successful and be happy. The government shouldn't put in restrictive laws that keep you from succeeding in life. That government should set up these avenues for success that individuals can achieve. So he believes the whole point of government is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That will drive his political career forever. When he becomes president of the United States, he believes that it's his job to defend life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of the American people. He always believed that the whole point of government is that. And that to secure these rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So this is the whole point of government. This is why men institute government. This is why we give them our consent, is we want them to protect our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's it. That's the whole point of government right there. And we allow them to, we give them our consent. We allow them to make rules over us, laws over us, all in the idea of protecting our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Goes on to say that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter to or abolish it and to institute new government among men. What Jefferson is saying in the Declaration of Independence is, King George III, you screwed up. We do not believe that you're protecting our life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness. To this point, we've given you our consent, but you've become destructive of these ideas. So now we, as a people, are going to go in a new direction. We don't think that you're protecting our life, liberty, or our pursuit of happiness. That's an interesting statement, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And, you know, if we were face to face, I would ask you this question. We would debate this a little bit. Do kings really have to have the consent of the governed? I mean, I thought the whole point of being a monarch was like God rubbed you on the head as a baby and said, you're the future king of England, and there it is, you're God's pick. I mean, don't they have this divine right of monarchs to govern because, well, God said so? Do they really have to listen to the consent of the governed? You might be quick to say no, kings can do whatever they please. But I would say go back and look at Charles I. And he did not have the consent of the governed. It triggered a civil war, and at the end of it all, he got his head cut off. Go back and look at James II. He did not have the consent of the governed. Parliament turned on him and took away his crown. So I would argue to you that even kings, people with complete control, even they have to have the consent of the governed if they're going to rule. All right. So, anyways, there you go. With this Declaration of Independence, it is political dynamite. It is changing the course of human history going forward. And man, these concepts like equality, that the whole point of government is life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. This was new stuff for 1776. We talk about it now, and it's like, yeah, okay, I get it. Cool, yeah, I have life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Yes, I understand all men are created equal. And people just didn't talk like that in 1776, especially that concept of equality. I mean, do you think King George III opened his copy of the Declaration of Independence, read that all men are created equal, and then looked across the way at his butlers and thought, oh, okay, so those guys are equal to me? Yeah, that just would not have computed in the mind of King George III. But it is a sea change going forward of political thinking. And it really is the birth of the United States of America. That document is our birthday. You know, the Declaration of Independence itself was actually agreed to by that Congress, First Continental Congress, on July 2. They said, yes, we will break away, we'll declare independence. The move was made on July 2. But the reason why we celebrate on July 4th is because that's the day that the Declaration of Independence itself, the document itself, was signed by the First Continental Congress. John Adams, who was there, wrote to his wife Abigail and said that July the 2nd will be forever remembered in the annals of history among men. He said that in the future, we'll pop fireworks and hold dances and celebrations on July 2nd in honor of this break of independence. Well, he's only off by a couple of days because we do wait just a couple more days to show respect for the document itself, its Declaration of Independence. That it's Jefferson who wrote it is, I don't know, I guess it's chance. They actually went to John Adams first and asked him if he would write a Declaration of Independence. They said, you know, we don't want to just say we're independent. We want to write a letter to the king explaining why. John Adams begged off. He said, you know, I'm busy. I got things to do. He would later admit that was a bad career move on his part. But they went around asking others if they would write it, and they all begged off. Privately, later, some of them would say, hey, look, declaring independence is a big, bold move. If we lose this war, then we'll be hanged as traitors to the British Empire. And if you're the person who wrote the Declaration of Independence, you can't talk your way out of that. You can't say, oops, my bad. If you're the author of the Declaration of Independence, you're going to hang from a tree if you should lose this war. So a lot of other people said, no, I don't want to do it. So finally, they settled on the kid in the room, young Thomas Jefferson, who was very soft-spoken. He would get embarrassed when he had to speak in public. Even when he was president, he would get very shy and embarrassed when he was addressing people. But Jefferson was brilliant, had a great education, was magic with words. And I mean, he just hit a grand slam with this Declaration of Independence here on July 4th, 1776. One more thing, because I can't help myself, and being as this is a recording, you're a captive audience, you don't have a choice. But years later, in 1863, our country will be in the middle of a civil war. And President Abraham Lincoln will be on a train headed to a very small town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Lincoln is going to give a speech at the ceremony for what's going to become known as the Gettysburg Cemetery. So many men died in combat at Gettysburg that it just didn't make any sense to transport the bodies somewhere else. They wanted to make a national grave site there at the battlefield. So Lincoln's trying to figure out on this train ride to Gettysburg what to say. And on the train ride, he just simply says to himself, well, they died for their country, right? These men died for America. That's a true statement, but then he asks another question, well, what is America? What does that mean to have died for one's country? And on a train headed to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, President Lincoln hit the nail right on the head. He said what these men died for was the concept of equality. What these men died for was the concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So Lincoln is saying that this is our country, that America is the Declaration of Independence, that we do hold these truths to be self-evident, and that those men who fought at Gettysburg, they were fighting for concepts like equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lincoln judged it right head on. He said that document right there is America. And it is our, how do I put this? It's our ethos, it's our heart, it's our soul, and it's what we as a people have always strived to be. It took a long time, I'm not going to lie to you. I would argue we're still fighting these things. You know, 2020, this experiment is still very much alive and going. Are men truly created equal? I mean, we've been fighting the equality fight forever. And, you know, in this time, in this first half American history class, the results are not very good on the equality fight. But then eventually, you know, we start to get civil rights, we get women's suffrage, we get rid of Jim Crow. And I don't know, America slowly but surely starts to wake up to her promise. She slowly but surely starts to wake up to her ideals. And they're very lofty goals, this concept of equality. I mean, honestly, will we ever truly get there? I don't know. I know we're better now than we were in 1776. But it's like this goal that you reach for that you never can quite reach. Right? You're always grasping for it, but it's so high, it's so lofty, you don't know if you're ever really truly going to reach that goal. But that's what Jefferson put before us. And Lincoln was right. This is our standard. This is what we try to reach, to live up to be. Again, it's a very powerful document from old Tom Jefferson of Virginia. All right, well, with a Declaration of Independence, now instead of fighting for our rights as Englishmen, as of July 1776, we're fighting for America. We're fighting for a new and independent nation. It's one thing to declare independence. It's another thing to win the war and achieve independence. Okay, looking at more changes brought about by the Revolution, now let's look at these new state governments that would emerge. So you used to be the colony of Virginia, but now you've declared independence, so you're the state of Virginia. And what happens here is you have to go through the process of no longer being a colony and forming a new state government. So new state governments will start to emerge that summer of 1776. Now, each one of these governments that will emerge, these new states, they will all be Republican in nature with some level of democracy. Let me explain that a little bit better because that might be a confusing statement. But they will all of them be a Republican style of government with some level of democracy. Okay, in the colonial age, we always trusted something called the Colonial Assembly. We're not colonies anymore, now we're states. So in place of a colonial assembly, we're going to have something new called a state legislature. There will be a Virginia state legislature. There will be a New York state legislature. So we're going to form these new state legislatures to replace what had been our colonial assemblies. To be a member of a state legislature, you had to be an adult white male property holder. And to vote for these individuals, you had to be an adult white male property holder. That's it for democracy right there. That's all. Just that little smidgen where the adult white male property holders have the right to vote. Okay, adult white male property holders elect a state legislature. These men convene in the new state capitals, begin passing laws. And here's where Republican government kicks in. There was just a smidgen of democracy here. The adult white male property holders put people into power. Once those people are into power, Republican government kicks in. Republican or representative government at that point kicks in. Once you put the state legislature into play, they have a lot of power. They're going to choose who the state governor is. That ain't a direct vote by the voters of the state. The state legislature will decide who the governor is. It will decide who the judges are. It can tax you. It can choose your representatives to the national government. So the adult white male property holders living in the states, they get to vote for these state legislators. But then when they meet, they start representing their constituents, their voters, by choosing all of this stuff. Governor, judges, taxes, representatives to the national government. So that's how it worked early on, where the states had a lot of power. State governments were very powerful entities in the Revolutionary Age. So adult white male property holders vote for these guys. That's just a smidgen of democracy there. And then once they come into power, they start representing those who voted for them by choosing pretty much everything else. Governor, the judges, taxes, on it goes. So it is representative government with just a very small smidgen of democracy. By the way, on that point of democracy there, I make this point again. They've declared independence. They could give everybody the right to vote if they want. But even with the Declaration of Independence, they stick with the adult white male property holders being in charge. Okay, social and economic reform. Religion is very straightforward. Letter B, number 1 here. All the new states embrace religious freedom. They all do. Again, Rhode Island carried that flag forward in the the colonial age. But now that we're no longer colonies, we've become states. They all break from the Church of England, and they all declare religious freedom. And that is such a huge thing for the future. We call America the melting pot, right? Where people come from over the world to America seeking opportunity. With religious freedom, people would come. But if you don't have religious freedom, we're not that melting pot. We're not getting people from all over the world unless they can come here and practice their own faiths. So yes, religious freedom will be embraced by all of these new state governments. Slavery is a mixed bag. There's bad and then there's really bad. So let's look at slavery. So one more time, we have this demarcation line in our country known as the Mason-Dixon line. The states that are north of the Mason-Dixon line, they're going to recognize the hypocrisy in slavery. We've just said that all men are created equal, right? We're basing a government on that idea. So north of the Mason-Dixon line, they begin to pass laws to eradicate slavery. but there's a mixed bag with that. It is a true statement that all the northern states did eradicate slavery, but they did not do it immediately, like right then and there, 1776. In fact, what a lot of these northern states did is they set up what were kind of like deadline days. Like the state of Pennsylvania could say, okay, we are going to abolish slavery, but it's going to happen 10 years from now on day X. So, yes, every northern state did outlaw slavery, but they put in like a deadline day, like it's going to happen in 10 years or so many years down the road. These northern states did this to give their slaveholders a chance to be ready for that, to prepare for the reality that they could no longer hold slaves. Now, when the deadline date came, there were slaveholders in the North who just simply lost their property. Their slaves just simply became free. But what a lot of those northern slaveholders did is they held on to their slaves until it got close to the deadline day. And when it was getting to a point where they were about to lose their slave property, a lot of these northern slaveholders took their slaves down south and sold them for whatever money they could get. So it didn't really bring freedom for all the slaves of the North. Many of them were sold off down in Virginia or Maryland for whatever price you could get. So yes, you can say that north of the Mason-Dixon, those states did eradicate slavery, but it took time. They did not do it immediately. And a lot of those slaves that were being held up north were just simply taken down south and sold for whatever money they could get. Didn't work out for all the slaves that were living up north. South of the Mason-Dixon, slavery's not going anywhere anytime soon. It's how they form their economy. It's also socially how they've structured their societies. So, yeah, they will not be freeing their slaves anytime soon. In fact, these men, these Southern men of the Revolutionary Age, will sort of leave this question lingering for their great-great-grandsons to figure out. And their great-great-grandsons will die at places named Shiloh, Antietam, and Gettysburg over this god-awful thing called slavery. So down south, slavery ain't going anywhere anytime soon, as they're going to hold on to it. Okay, the next point of aristocracy. This is letter B, number 3. Aristocracy is nobility. It's noble titles. The Earl of Sandwich, the Duke of York, and things like that. Well, in becoming states, all of these state governments said, we do not recognize aristocratic titles within our states. What they're saying there is aristocrats are not going to be in control of our regions or our areas just because of their birth. No aristocratic titles in America. Instead, we're going to become what's called a meritocracy. Merit, like you earn it, M-E-R-I-T, then O-C-R-A-C-Y, meritocracy. In America, you earn it. Or you're born to rich parents who did it for you, but you could argue they earned it, right? And then they gave it to you. So we will not have aristocratic titles in the United States. Last I checked, there is not an Earl of Tarrant County or a Duke of Fort Worth. So yeah, we got rid of all those aristocratic titles in becoming new states. Well, Tories are people who stayed loyal to the British throughout the Revolution. And a lot of the aristocrats who were living in the United States became Tories. Tories were people who woke up on July 5 and read the paper and were like, we did what? Yeah, I don't want to declare independence. I like being a part of the British Empire. So Tories stayed loyal. And the aristocrats that were living in the United States, those of noble birth, they sided with the Tory cause. They sided with staying loyal to the British Empire. And it was kind of tough being a Tory in revolutionary America. The population turned on these people real quick. And what happened is these new state governments took away the titles, the lands, and the possessions of these aristocrats. They basically stole their property. It kind of works like this. The state of New York, right? This new state government that's been created. But the state of New York would go to an Earl of Sandwich type living in the backcountry of New York and say, yeah, we don't recognize your aristocratic title. So this home, this 100 acres of land, that carriage, those horses, those slaves, they all now belong to the state of New York. So these new state governments stole aristocratic property and took everything that they had. What most of these Tory aristocrats did is they got the heck out of America while the getting was good. A lot of them ran way up north to places like Nova Scotia, got into Canada, where they could go back to England to live out their lives. This wasn't necessarily a kind act by these new state governments, confiscating aristocratic land and property. But hey, it's kind of hard being a loyalist here in these newly formed United States of America. Last point I want to make before we get on to the Articles of Confederation. You should understand that these state governments were very, very powerful things. Okay, so you go back to the colonial age, and adult white male property holders trusted the colonial assembly. They could vote for it, they could serve on it. Remember, the colonial assembly is the thing that fought for them, that stood up to royal authority. So now that it's their turn to create government, they put all their faith in these state legislatures, into these state governments. They used to trust the colonial government, the colonial assembly. Now they're going to put all their faith in the state government that they can vote for, that they can serve on. So yes, the founding fathers at first were very big on state power. Later, an argument that will be called states' rights. But the thing is, those same founding fathers will recognize after the revolution that the states have too much power and that we need a strong federal government if we're going to go forward and last as a nation. So you can make the argument that yes, indeed, the founding fathers did stand for states' rights kind of ideology, but those same founding fathers would a few years later admit that they had made a mistake, and they would then stand for a strong federal government, a new constitution, if you will, that will get along the way. But yes, at first, these new state governments were very, very powerful. Later on in our class, we'll be looking at the U.S. Civil War. And when the southern states begin to leave, to secede, E is your only vowel in that word, by the way, S-E-C-E-D-E. There's no U in secede. The South did not succeed. It's seceded. But anyway, when the southern states do secede, they'll say that the federal government has become too powerful. It's infringing upon their property rights, their slaveholding property rights. And the southern states will say that we are the true heirs of the American Revolution, that we are fighting for states' rights and state power as our founding fathers intended for it to be. You could take that as a factual statement that the southern states were making, that they were the heirs of the American Revolution going with states' rights ideology, but that shows that you didn't read the rest of the history book. That you didn't then see that, okay, well, these same founding fathers admitted that that was wrong, that was a mistake, and created a strong federal government that you're now resisting and fighting against. So anyway, I probably should just leave it at that. But in this age, the states have all the power, and the federal government is very weak. It's very ineffective, and the founding fathers intended for that to be. Okay, our first United States government was called the Articles of Confederation. It was beginning to form in 1776. It would be fully formed by 1781. But the Articles of Confederation were our first Uncle Sam. Today's world, we live under the Constitution of the United States. But before there was a Constitution of the United States, there was the Articles of Confederation. And this government was made to be weak, intentionally made to be a weak national government. Now, going off the experience of what these men have gone through under British control, the founding fathers, the guys who were sort of forming this country here at these moments, they did not like strong power from England. They're mad at the king. They're mad at Parliament. And a lot of that anger and resentment towards a strong national government plays out in how they formed the Articles of Confederation. Okay, the Articles of Confederation government did have an executive branch. It did have what you would call a president of the United States. But the executive branch was nothing more than a figurehead that had no power at all, which is exactly what they wanted their king to be, just a figurehead with no actual real power. Nobody wanted to be president under the Articles of Confederation. There is a scene along the way where at one point, like they're drawing straws to see who could go on to be the president under the Articles of Confederation. It had no power. It was just being a puppet. It was just a figurehead. And nobody wanted to be president under that government. Later, when we get a constitution and we make this thing stronger, everybody wants to be president under the Constitution. But really, nobody wanted to be president under the Articles of Confederation. So there was an executive branch, but it did not have any power, didn't have any teeth. There was a legislative branch. This legislative branch, it had representatives from all 13 states, but it was a one-house legislature. It wasn't a two-house like we have now. The legislative branch, the Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, was a one-house Congress. That one-house Congress did not have the power to tax. Could not tax. Remember, that's something they were mad at the British about, right? Stamp Act and things like that. So the Articles of Confederation has a one-house legislature, and it cannot tax, nor can it tariff. Again, we're mad at the British about doing those things. So in creating a national government, they're looking at the British and saying, okay, well, how would we have wanted the British Empire to be? And they're making a legislative branch that is weak, does not have the power to tax, nor can it tariff. In fact, the only way that this government really could make money was by selling public land. And you'll have to forgive people. There's not a lot of real estate going on in the middle of a combat zone. So there weren't a lot of land sales taking place throughout the revolution. And because they created this thing so weak, so ineffective, Congress had a really hard time paying for the war. Like they just couldn't generate the money they needed to pay for the war. Washington's army almost mutinied on 3 separate occasions because it wasn't getting paid for its service. So they did have a legislative branch, but it could not tax, nor could it tariff. Again, really the only way it could make money was by selling public land or just borrowing from other countries. And, in that situation, you got to pay it back. We won the war in spite of ourselves, truth be told. Really, we won the war because, thankfully, France would join the cause. But we really shot ourselves in the foot with this weak national government. Last statement to make, there was not a judicial branch. There were no federal courts. There was not a Supreme Court, if you will. So, yeah, there were no judges at the federal level. If you don't have a judicial branch, if you don't have a court of law, you don't really have law. Because if you don't have someone to make decisions on that law and things like that, you don't really have law. So under the Articles of Confederation, the Founding Fathers intentionally created a weak national government. It did have an executive branch, but it didn't have any power. It did have a legislative branch, but it too had no power to tax or tariff. And there was not a judicial branch under the Articles of Confederation. Now that question of greater democracy, nope, not even close. Again, they stick with adult white male property holders as the only people who can vote. To be chosen to be in the national government, you had to be an adult white male property holder to boot. So we have very powerful states. We have a very weak national government. And these adult white male property holders of the Revolutionary Age are creating exactly the type of government that they wanted under British rule. But they will find shortly after this revolution is over with that it's very hard to govern with such a weak and ineffective national government. All right, to summarize these changes, you have a Declaration of Independence, which brings about a new nation, new state governments that are very powerful, but a federal government that is extremely weak. All right, now getting on into the war itself and trying to wrap up this topic. Pretty long one. I understand that. But it is a big topic. But in looking at the general nature of the conflict, down there on the bottom left-hand side, we've got George Washington. Um, it's a tough thing to try to wage this war. Now, George Washington really wanted to fight sort of your classic military style battles. That is to say, you march in strength with all your soldiers. You go out looking for your enemy. You've got scouts, you've got advanced troops, and you spot each other. So everyone starts marching towards one another to engage. You end up meeting in some poor bastard's peach orchard, and you have it at each other, you kill each other, you destroy this guy's property, his farm. And when it's all said and done, if enough of your guys are left standing, you win that battle. You string together a series of those type things, and you can win the whole war. And Washington really wanted to go toe-to-toe classic military-style battles against the British Empire. But he found out real quick early on that every time he went toe-to-toe with the British Empire, he got his butt kicked, he got his nose bloodied. And George figured out real quick that we couldn't fight classic military-style battles. That if we just continued to engage the British like that full strength, this war wasn't going to last very long, and it was going to end in a horrible defeat for the U.S. Army. So George decided to change tactics, and a lot of credit should be given to the man for doing that. Sometimes military leaders can prove to be very stubborn men who just sort of stick with their idea, and this will work. Just keep pushing, and then they end up losing the war because they were so pig-headed and stubborn. So a lot of credit should be given to George Washington for recognizing that this was failing and he needed to change. He needed to come up with a new idea. So he'll start doing what modern people call guerrilla warfare. And that's spelled Guerilla. We're not talking about the animal here. But guerrilla warfare is hit and run tactics. You engage the enemy when you have numerical superiority. You disengage, you run away, if you will, when they have numerical superiority on you. So you hit where you can, you hit smaller targets, you continue to harass. But really, Washington understood that his main goal was just to keep his army alive, to keep his army intact. Because as long as there was an American army, there was a threat. There could be a revolution, there could be a war. But the moment that he and his boys were defeated, that's it. The war is over with. There's nothing left with which to fight. I know that was a hit to his pride. I know that he rather would have just gone out and fought the classic military way. But again, kudos to George for recognizing that that was not going to be a winning formula, and he really had to change. He had to shake things up. Okay, well, along the way, there are some keys to colonial success. Two battles in particular that I just want to take a moment or two to talk about. And under number 2, letter A, the first one to look at is Saratoga. This takes place in October of 1777. Now, the Battle of Saratoga was fought in upper state New York. Saratoga is this area along the Hudson River. That's way north of New York City, along the Hudson, up in this area known as Saratoga. But the British had sent a massive army out of Canada, and that massive army out of Canada was trying to take the state of New York out. Its goal really was to march across the state of New York, capture it, then link up with forces that were already in New York City, and on they go. But what happened at Saratoga was there's a bit of luck involved, but there's also some strategy. But American sharpshooters, snipers, if you will, played a big role in winning this battle at Saratoga. As the British Army was marching out of Canada through the forests and the trees heading south, the American Army used Native American allies, hunters, trackers, if you will. They also used snipers. And what they did is they effectively took out the officer corps of that British Army as it marched. Like imagine you got a sharpshooter sitting up on a hilltop or maybe climbed up in a tree, and he's got an opportunity to fire a shot. Now, the idea was to not waste that shot on a private, just a foot soldier. But if you had that opportunity, that shot, you take it and you hit the guys who have a lot of medals on their uniform, the guys who are officers. It's kind of a strange thing, but as that British Army marched through the woods, through the forest, onto Saratoga, the U.S. Army was taking out sergeants and lieutenants and colonels. So that by the time the British Army did finally reach Saratoga, a lot of its officer corps was dead. And people talk about how that British Army at Saratoga was like a massive ship without a rudder. You could tell your guys to march forward, but then in the heat of combat, there weren't officers there on the front lines telling them what else to do. So by taking out a lot of their officer corps, the British weren't able to make tough decisions in the moment, right, tactically on the battlefield. And that led in large part to the American success at Saratoga. Saratoga was an American victory. It's the first really major American victory in the Revolutionary War. With this victory here at Saratoga, it's a huge morale boost for the country. Because honestly, to that point, the headlines were pretty negative as far as the combat was concerned. We weren't winning a lot of battles. But Saratoga was a huge morale boost for the people living in America. It was proof that we could win this war. But I think the most important outcome of Saratoga is it leads directly to the French alliance with the United States. Now, in looking at this French alliance, as soon as the Declaration of Independence was being signed, the Continental Congress, which was becoming the U.S. Congress, but still for a moment they were the Continental Congress, asked Benjamin Franklin if he would be so kind as to go to France and try to get the new country any help that he could achieve. Ben Franklin was the most famous American at the time. He was a scientist, inventor, Renaissance man, newspaper man. He really was like a famous guy for that time. Ben Franklin agreed to go on to Paris to try to get some help from the French. Anything he could get, weapons, money, support, whatever they were willing to give. It wasn't too hard to convince Ben to go to Paris. Ben loved parties. He loved having fun, and what better place to be than Paris, right? For that sort of stuff. But Ben Franklin arrives in Paris. He meets with King Louis XVI. He's the king of France at this time. And Louis XVI and Louis's court, his people there in the government, they loved Franklin. They thought he was amusing and funny and intelligent and witty. They just fell madly in love with Ben Franklin. They thought he was so great. But their Franklin would be making them laugh, telling them fascinating stories. And then it would get awkward as he would say, well, Your Majesty, my country really could use some help. Anything your people could do to help in the war. And then the mood would turn real somber as Louis would say, yeah, I'm sorry, we're just not going to give you any support. The French honestly thought that the Americans were going to lose this war. The idea was, why give money to a losing cause and then you just lose money? So yeah, Louis XVI and the French government, they were not at first going to give support to the American cause. Quite frankly, they thought it was a losing cause. But then Saratoga happened. And Saratoga was legitimate. It was real. It's an honest-to-God combat victory by the American Army. So now when Franklin goes to Louis XVI and he's amusing him and telling him funny stories and interesting facts, he can now say, Your Majesty, news has come from North America of this great victory at Saratoga. And now he can talk to Louis XVI about a big win. Momentum is now on the side of the Americans. And the victory at Saratoga was enough to convince the French to go ahead and form an alliance with the United States. And the French alliance would mean everything in winning this war. I've always tried to tell my students this. Sometimes they don't like it. Sometimes I get emails after class about this. But no France, no America. There it is. That's as simple as you can put it. If we don't have the help of France throughout the remainder of this war, I just don't know that our country does exist. Before the French alliance, America had a puncher's chance. There's always a chance, right? But with the French alliance, it's now a 50-50 proposition. We now have a major European power who can help us in the fight. But even with the help of France, it's still a 50-50 shot. I mean, look, the British continued to win battles. They continued to take most of America's major cities. So even with the French alliance, it was a 50-50 dicey proposition that America could pull it off and go on and win. That French alliance signed in 1778 was supposed to be eternal. It was supposed to be an alliance between our two countries that would go on forever. It didn't even outlast the 1700s. It didn't even last like another 22 odd years. But anyway, the French alliance meant a professional army. No disrespect to George and our boys who are doing their best, but the French have professional training. They have sophisticated weaponry. So they bring that to the table, a better equipped professional army. The French are going to come to the United States and teach our boys how to fight. They're going to teach our boys how to about face and march, and they're going to give them tactics that work. So you have the presence of a real professional army under the command of Lafayette, the guy you see down there at the bottom in the middle of our outline or our slide. Lafayette will be in command of all French forces in the American Revolution. He and Washington formed a friendship right off the bat. I think Washington understood how valuable this guy was, and he was really nice to him, right? Real cordial. But truth be told, those two would remain lifelong friends. They really would. They formed a real solid bond in the American Revolution. Lafayette would come back to America many years later and write a big book about what he saw in America, like some 20, 25 years later. Okay, so the French alliance meant a professional army with professional training and better weapons. It also meant a navy. We didn't really have one, but the French had a big navy. And so now the French can take the fight to the British on the high seas. The British can now help us in fights to recapture port cities, for example. So now the French Navy is brought into the war. The French alliance also meant money. We could borrow money from France. They would give us the money that we would need for certain things. And it's really tragic that our own government couldn't generate revenue for the war. But the French did help us out financially in the conflict. By the way, a side note there, France lending us that money is really going to lead to more of her financial problems that she already had. And yeah, it's another one of those little reasons for a French Revolution that'll come later on. But as I said, even with the help of France, it was still a 50-50 proposition as to whether or not America might win the war. But then the next big moment in the conflict to talk about is the battle at Yorktown. If you look on our outline on the top right-hand side, I have that little map of the city of Yorktown. But Yorktown is located along the coast of Virginia. And by 1781, people in England are starting to grow tired of this war. People in England are asking some tough questions of the government. Why is this revolution taking so long? If winning this war means killing someone named George Washington, why isn't he dead? So by 1781, common people in England have grown tired of this war. It's expensive, right? The debt's going back up. Remember all the debt problems from the last war? This war is even more expensive than the last one. So the debt problem is there. The body bags are piling up. And it's just a feeling in England like the government doesn't have a clue what it's trying to do. It just feels like there's not a plan for success that's going on here. By the way, those will be the exact same problems that the United States will face during the Vietnam War. It was expensive, the body bags were piling up, and it just looked like we didn't have a strategy for winning. But you know, that's something you deal with in second half American history. I'll stick to first half. But by 1781, people in England want some results. They want something tangible that is proof that they can win this war. So in 1781, a fellow by the name of Cornwallis, he's a general in the British military, General Cornwallis comes up with a plan that he thinks could change the course of the war. It's a haymaker of sorts that he believes will show the people of England the war can be won, and that it'll go a long way towards ending the conflict. All right, well, here's Cornwallis's big plan. He wants to capture the state of Virginia. Now, they would have called it the colony of Virginia. We're mincing our words there. But Cornwallis wants to capture Virginia, just invade it and capture it by force. His feeling there is if you can capture Virginia, you effectively divide the United States. And Napoleon will be so good at this during the French Revolution. Once you divide, you conquer, right? So you take Virginia, essentially dividing America. Then you conquer the South. And when that's over with, you take everything against the North. And war's over. British victory. It's actually not a bad idea. That's the policy they'll go with in 1781 because, they agreed, the military agreed it was not a bad idea at all. So Cornwallis's big plan starts with offloading these troops at the city of Yorktown. The British Navy will start offloading men, supplies, material into the port city of Yorktown. And from there, the idea is to break out and go on and capture the remainder of Virginia. All right, well, after years of guerrilla warfare, hit and run, evasion, Lafayette, through his spies, found out that the British were going to be having this big effort at Yorktown. Lafayette got a hold of George Washington and said, "Look, my spies tell me this is the next big move, the British landing at the city of Yorktown." So thanks to the spies and thanks to Lafayette, George Washington knows that Cornwallis is planning a big invasion at the city of Yorktown. So George Washington decides to take action, right? No more running, no more hiding. It's time to make a bold move. George Washington will ask Lafayette if he would be so kind as to send the French Navy into the York River to engage the British Navy that's there. Lafayette agrees. He commands the French Navy to sail with all haste that way. And it's kind of hard to see that map there in the top right-hand corner of our slide, but you can kind of see where it says the York River, and there are black boats and there are red boats. The black boats are the French, the red boats are the British, and this huge French Navy shows up in the York River, heavily outnumbering the British boats. The British could have stayed, I guess, and fought hard and valiantly and died, but no matter what, they would have died. So instead, the British chose to live another day, and they retreat from the York River. So the French have captured the York River. They've captured the outskirts of Yorktown. And at that point, any men, material, supplies that have been offloaded, that's all that Cornwallis is going to get. He did not get his whole army or their supplies or their things offloaded. So at that point, the French Navy has cut Cornwallis off from his supplies. It's cut him off from the British Navy by taking the York River. Also, the French Navy can now pound Yorktown day and night with its heavy guns, and that's cause for concern for Cornwallis's army as well. But while all that is taking place, Washington also asked Lafayette if he would be so kind as to have the French army march with all haste towards Yorktown, which they will do. At the same time, Washington will muster the U.S. military to march with all haste towards Yorktown as well. And you can see there on your little map on the top right-hand corner, everything in black on the left-hand side is the French. All that stuff in blue coming in from the south is the Americans. So they basically bottle Cornwallis up at Yorktown. He's surrounded. Cornwallis and the Brits are surrounded at Yorktown. The river to their back, the Americans and the French to their other sides. And from there, it was just this big campaign that lasted 2 months. Heavy fighting every day for more ground, more ground, more ground. And slowly but surely, the Americans and the French were getting closer and closer to Yorktown. They were taking out the British defenses with each passing day. And in October of 1781, Cornwallis realized that he couldn't do it anymore. His men were low on shot, powder, and supplies. So in October of 1781, Cornwallis surrenders his army to George Washington. And this big move that was supposed to be the haymaker to win the war, that was supposed to turn the tide, the British couldn't even get off the beaches at Yorktown, for God's sakes, and push on into Virginia. This proves to be the last major campaign of the American Revolution here at Yorktown in October of 1781. Washington accepts Cornwallis' surrender. And with that, there would still be some minor fighting in other places, but this is the last major campaign of the American Revolution. Well, eventually, word of the defeat at Yorktown reaches England. King George III is upset. The government is stunned. And the people of England are making some critical comments about their government. I thought this was supposed to be the big haymaker. This was the big strategy, and we couldn't even get out of Yorktown, for God's sakes. So with the defeat at Yorktown, the press in England is calling for an end to the war. The people in England are calling for an end to the war. So eventually, King George III agrees to meet with the Americans in Paris. And here you can see we have a Treaty of Paris for 1783. You'll recall when we started this topic like 2.5 hours ago that we were talking about a Treaty of Paris in 1763. Look, treaties make for really great questions on tests, not only for test 1, but for all the tests you'll take for me this semester. And yes, you're going to have to know the difference between the Treaty of Paris in 1763 and the one in 1783. I'll do you one better. You might even need to be able to write out the years and know which year is what in these treaties of Paris. And you know, the only difference is a number, right? The Treaty of Paris has a 6, or the Treaty of Paris 1763 is that 6, and then the Treaty of Paris 1783, there's the 8. And that's the only difference in the numbers, right? Is a 6 and an 8. Well, the Treaty of Paris 1763 was the end of the French and Indian War. The British took all that land to the Mississippi River. So now let's look at the Treaty of Paris 1783, which is the official end of the American Revolution. That's point number 1. It is the end of the American Revolution. This treaty, by the way, is negotiated by John Adams and Ben Franklin. Franklin was already in Paris. He didn't have to go anywhere. But the government sent John Adams to help in the negotiations. Number 1, the American Revolution is over. Number 2, the United States is an independent nation. England gives up any and all claims that she may have had to those 13 colonies. That's point number 2 to the Treaty of Paris 1783. The United States is a free and independent nation. Point number 3, the United States will claim all that land to the Mississippi River. Basically, everything you see in green on that map on the bottom right-hand corner, the United States will claim all the way from the Atlantic to the Mississippi and all points in between. So America is going to get a huge, huge amount of land out of this war. Point number 3, the United States goes from the Atlantic all the way to the Mississippi River. Now, the British will still control Canada after all this, and truth be told, they still have Canada. It's a commonwealth of the British Empire. But America will go from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. Okay, point number 4. The British agree to remove all their troops from U.S. soil. They will take their soldiers out of the United States of America. Now, a side note to that point number 4, the British removing their troops from U.S. soil. They mostly did a good job of that. Definitely along the eastern seaboard, they left America. But way out in the west, in the Great Lakes, the British would actually keep troops on U.S. soil out there in the Great Lakes region. That's going to cause some problems later on down the road. We're going to have to go to war with the British again in something called the War of 1812. And one of the sticking points in getting to a War of 1812 is the fact that forever the British would not remove their troops from U.S. soil up there in the Great Lakes. Point number 5, the United States government agreed to compensate aristocrats for their lost property. You remember the aristocrats had their homes, their land, their possessions taken by those new state governments. Well, the U.S. government agreed to compensate aristocrats for their lost property. A little side note on that. Point. Those people never saw a stinking dime. I don't know. It was Paris. It was a feel-good moment. Yeah, what the heck? We'll throw that in. Yeah, the United States never paid those people for their property that was lost. And by the way, that's going to be a sticking point too. The United States will say to the British in years after all this, hey, you said you would take your troops off our soil. You signed the Treaty of Paris, 1783. Why haven't you taken your troops off our soil up there in the Great Lakes? And the British will say, well, hey, you said you'd compensate aristocrats for their lost property, but they haven't received any money. So, yeah, it's true, we're violating the treaty, but so are you. So there will be that little bit of animosity back and forth between the two countries. The rest of the treaty deals with who gets to fish where. I don't care about who gets to fish where. So with the Treaty of Paris, 1783, the American Revolution is over. The United States is an independent nation with borders that extend all the way to the Mississippi River. The British agree to remove their troops from our soil, and the United States agrees to compensate aristocrats for their lost property. All right, well, the United States in 1783 does exist. It is a reality. It has quite a potential for something great. I mean, it's this new idea, this government based on equality, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It's got Republican styles of government with a little bit of a democratic process. This experiment's just getting started, really, in 1783. And America holds a lot of potential going forward. But really, in 1783, a lot of Americans sort of like celebrated the victory, celebrated the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Then, after the celebration, they woke up and said, oh, wait a minute, we're in charge of all this. You mean we have to govern? We have to form an economy? And it turns out winning a war is one thing, and creating a country is a whole nother fight altogether. So in 1783, America does exist. It does have potential, but it also has a bit of a tough road ahead of it in trying to form a nation that can provide security, give people economic prosperity. That's a tough road coming forward for the United States. But that's the end of the material for exam number 1. I will also post a review to help get you ready for exam 1. But, in your notes, you might make some sort of a demarcation line that says that's it for exam 1. Once I finish this, that's it. But that's up to you, whatever you want to do. All right, so I'm going to post that review for exam 1. Do watch it. Do go over it. I'll give you some pointers and things that'll help get you prepared. Yeah, best of luck to each of you.